This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at Kevin Kautzman and at Brad Kelly. All right, and we are back with another action-packed episode of the podcast about the dark side of creativity, Art of Darkness. I'm Kevin Kautzman, joined by my partner in crime, Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
I'm doing really well, man. I am ready to go. I have been reading James Joyce bio for the last month straight, it feels like. So I'm ready to go, man. I am dialed in. I am buckled up.
You got ahead of things. I mean, this is going to, what's the episode about? James Joyce.
Yeah,
Your brain is all scrambled.
Else.
You're telling the story out of order. Everything is disjointed. Yeah. And we have a very special guest. Do you want to introduce our guest for the show?
Yeah. So people who listen to Art of Darkness probably already know our friend Aldous Asterion, host of the magnificent Forest of Symbols podcast. He is gonna help us with duties tonight because he's a Joyce fan, and also I kind of couldn't get through Finnegan's Wake is ultimately
you brought in a ringer is what you're telling me.
That's what I'm saying. And that's no disrespect to Joyce. That's a fault of mine. Let me say right up front. But
you're one of the few. I mean, come on, everybody's read Finnegan's Wake.
That's right.
the notorious beach read page turner.
That's right, Finnegan's Wake. Yeah. So so we're gonna we're gonna get right into it, I suppose. And we'll start with our classic question, Kevin. What do you know about James Joyce?
What do I know about James Joyce? Irish.
I missed that part in my prep.
Sort of the great prince of modernism, ornate, very heavily kind of a maximalist modernist. Long, difficult novels. Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. The Dubliners. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is it just Dubliners?
It's just Dubliners, yeah.
Dubliners, yeah. Mm-hmm. Stately Plump Buck Mulligan. We have the great Ulysses, which all sorts of scandals and lots of highbrow, lowbrow, high society. Is this art, etc.
Yeah.
Conflicts and things, and then of course the great crossword puzzle of a novel, Finnegan's Wake. I also know Joyce and Beckett were pals.
Yeah, there's a story there that we'll get to as well. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Beckett kind of worked with him for a while, actually, and was a friend of the family.
There you go. Yeah, and then of course the very naughty letters. Which I believe might come up.
We'll tease them a little bit, and then we're going to get into those in the After Dark for patrons only.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I know.
Yeah, I mean, and that's all true. A couple little notes on that, I think, just in terms of legacy before we really jump into it. I think James Joyce might be the most claimed to have read him author. Where people say they read it and didn't really, and understandably so, for all the reasons that you say. I mean, we'll talk about it. Like, there were famous writers of renown at his time who spoke highly of Ulysses but couldn't finish it. including Yeats and some others. So
I still feel like at this point I am claiming to have read Joyce.
Yeah, I read Ulysses, and then I listened to, there was a podcast that was just going scene by scene in Ulysses. Every week there was like a 5 to 20 minute episode, and I literally just read the book, and he would have an episode about something big. I don't remember that happening at all. I don't know what he's talking
Is that
about.
the Frank Delaney?
Yeah, Frank Delaney.
Podcast?
Yes.
Yeah, that's really good.
It's
I believe
fantastic.
I think that he died and unfortunately is not able to finish the whole book.
Yeah, somebody needs to pick that up. That might be a job for one of the three of us. Kevin, you're up, I think.
Okay.
I'm not doing it.
So generally, how duties I think are going to work here, and this is a I was almost going to say an international effort, but not quite. We're in 3 time zones here, the three of us doing this. So we're gonna tackle it the best we can. Generally, I'm gonna do the bio stuff, and we're gonna lean on our special guest to kind of talk of the books. But of course, there's gonna be plenty of diversion and fun stuff in between. So
right, and a little bit of housekeeping. The show is at artofdarkpod.com. You can find us on Twitter at Art of Dark Pod. We're now accepting crypto donations by request. Floki to Valhalla. If you want to donate crypto, you can do that on the website.
And do it on a dip, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. We'll take whatever you want to send along. Whatever crazy coin you want to send, we'll take it.
Right.
Please don't dust my wallet with garbage. But there's another great way to support the show, and that is through Patreon, which is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. And Patreon subscribers get extra episodes. We call these After Dark, and that's where we get really rough and rowdy. We keep an extra story that's particularly spicy. And I believe, Brad, did you already hint this a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. We're gonna talk. We're gonna talk some intimate details of Joyce and his wife, as reflected in the wonderful and floral writings of Joyce to her. So
yes, and so that's a great place to go to support the show. These shows, obviously, we're not getting money just straight out of the ether. So if you want to support independent media, support the show. Patreon's a good way to do it. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. All right, Brad, let's go. James Joyce, Dublin. Woo. Where am I? Put me in time and place.
Okay, I'm gonna set us in. James Joyce is born in February 2nd, 1882, but I'm actually going to start us sort of in 1904, and there's a really good reason for this. But I want the listener and Kevin and Aldous to kind of imagine, we're just going to kind of get ourselves in the mindset here. So it's 1904. It's Dublin. It's a city of 400,000 people, which is about the size of Minneapolis, apparently. So big city for the time. It's still racked by trauma of oppression by the English. Some of it very, very fresh.
The eternal Anglo.
Yes, yeah. So you're James Joyce. You're 22 years old. Your name, the name Joyce, means almost nothing to anybody but you at this point. You're standing by the River Liffey, which you would later use in your work to mean time and femininity and life. And you would become eventually so good at you would master the metaphor to the extent that you can make anything mean anything. So, right? You're the sort of primordial writer at this age of 22. And you know that you're a genius, but you haven't really done anything. You're just a poor Irish kid. Okay, so you tried to live abroad. It's 1904. You tried to live abroad a couple years earlier, and you literally got homesick and couldn't fend for yourself and had to come home. You're the oldest son of a man who's basically become something of a joke around town, a lazy tax collector who couldn't even really manage that. That is the best kind of tax collector. Yeah, well, I agreed. That's why he had a lot of friends. People really liked him.
Just quit.
Right. You're the oldest child of 10, and your entire life, your dad has been dragging you from one borough of Dublin to another, just trying to stay one step ahead of his debts. Right. Your mother has died the year before, 1903. And while you loved her and depended on her for her affection, you're so arrogant and so resentful of Catholicism that even when she asked you to come pray by her bedside, you refused. Right?
Resentful of the one true faith, Brad?
Yeah. See, to Joyce, Catholicism was fine if you were in France or someplace else, but in Ireland, Catholicism was like black magic.
Oh.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll get into that a little bit too. And now I said your name doesn't mean anything, but people do know you're smart. They might not really think you're a genius, but they know they see something going on with you, right? You've met Yeats, who, even though you offended, somehow would want to do favors for you for the rest of your life. You've met Lady George. You've met George Russell, who went by Ash, A.E., who was a well-known poet at the time. And they know you mostly because you're this sort of clearly intelligent, hot-headed, cocky, arrogant kid. That's how they know you at this point. And they all kind of see you've got potential, but you haven't really done anything yet, right? Now, you're standing by the river.
We're kind of, hang on here. You're painting a wonderful picture.
This is what I'm going for.
I'm really getting it. Yeah. And you're using the second person. I really appreciate the effect there.
I'm trying to keep your attention, Kevin.
You are. You've got my attention. We are kind of in Oscar Wilde times.
Correct? I don't remember Oscar Wilde's years exactly, but he would be James Joyce is either the tail end of Oscar Wilde's generation or the next generation.
Yeah.
So so now, okay, so you're in Dublin, the banks of the River Liffey. Now, one day you meet this woman as you're walking Nassau Street, which is this road, the street's still there. Now you can get like a Starbucks there and buy some like American shoes, but you're between the River Liffey and the bay. And this tall, young, auburn-haired woman is walking along with a proud stride, and you get to chatting with her. And this is Nora Barnacle, the ridiculous name of Barnacle. And now, Kevin,
her surname is Barnacle?
Barnacle.
Wow.
Kevin, what
clearly
is
she was a Joyce character already.
He invented her. Yeah, and there were jokes about how clinging and like you can't get rid of a barnacle, right? Like that's what a barnacle is.
Yeah.
Even James's father said that. His father was
bottom
like,
of the boats is a barnacle. Right.
Yeah. Just clamps on and it's there forever, right?
It's like the simp of the ocean.
That's right. Now, this is a couple days later, you start exchanging letters with this woman, and a couple days later you guys meet on June 16th of 1904 and take a walk around Ringsend, which is a notable story in Joyce's life. And what you don't really know, of course you don't know, is that 100 years later, on that exact day, June 16th, the literary and artistic and highfalutin world is going to have a festival in your name right near where you have this date. Right?
Bloomsday, correct?
Bloomsday. And Bloomsday would be the day in which the entirety of the book Ulysses, that great masterpiece, happened. So I like this where he's posed in time here. So one kind of comment about Nora, and this is going to play in later, much later. So if you can remember this when at the end, I think you're going to see a loop here. Joyce said something in a very early letter to her that really kind of stuck out to me as playing on or suggesting what Joyce's sort of psychological needs were. He wrote, "Is there one who understands me?" ? And what he was saying is, he met Nora and he thought, maybe there is finally somebody who gets me, right? He thought of her as being sort of pure of soul. And he thought that when she looked at him, she actually saw him, right? And he felt like nobody had ever done that before. Now, whether that's true or not, we're going to maybe kind of find out. So, kind of drop out of that whole second person thing. I just wanted to get us in time and place and kind of know who we're dealing with and get us into his head a little bit. But so now, Kevin, you mentioned Dubliners, and I don't know if you've read Dubliners.
The Joyce that I've read was a valiant attempt at Ulysses, which I'm afraid I may have failed at. Yeah. But I have read Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man.
It's a great book.
The rest of it I'm not familiar with.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna kind of start. I want to kind of start with Dubliners with a little bit of bio, and then we'll start this kind of discussing this book. the story of how it came to be is really curious. James had written a bunch of stuff, essays and reviews and poems and things like this at that time. But in 1904, the same year he meets Nora, a little bit later in the year, his friend Ash, is George Russell, had said to Joyce, hey, I work in this magazine called the Irish Homestead, and if you'll send us a story, we'll give you £1 for it, and we publish it. We'll give you £1 for it. And it's the Irish Homesteader is a magazine about like agricultural society, right? And so Ash had asked him to write something simple, rural, live making, and pathetic. That is something you could have sympathy for the characters in, and which would not shock the readers. Joyce delivers the first version of his story, The Sisters, which would go in Dubliners, which wouldn't be published as a book for many, many years. So Aldous, Dubliners, I don't know what if you can start to tell us about Dubliners a little bit.
Yeah, well, Dubliners is a portrait of Dublin as Joyce saw it at the time, and his view on it. And as we'll go through it, the career, we're going to realize that Joyce had a ton of criticisms of Dublin, but he never stopped writing about it. So, whether he left or stayed, mentally, he was always there. But I think Dubliners is hugely critical of this place. And essentially, he believes that it's a place that you cannot thrive in, that one way or another, it's going to trap you and pull you down by many, many different avenues of defeat. And so I don't know if we've mentioned this yet, but Dubliners is a collection of 15 short stories. Mm-hmm. They don't really connect to each other except thematically, but thematically they form a pretty coherent statement, I would say. And Kevin, you mentioned earlier the word maximalist, and I think that that really fits Joyce. And especially if you come to this from the later books, you might be surprised at the style of Dubliners, because it's actually somewhat more minimal. It's actually kind of closer to somebody like Hemingway in terms of its style. It actually works by subtraction rather than addition. So he'll leave key things out and leave you to guess at certain things. And there are also these like odd kind of enigmas that Joyce starts putting in there, and he'll do this, throughout his books until they just sort of pile up on every page in Finnegan's Wake. But like an example of this kind of in embryo is the story Evelyn in Dubliners, where we have a young woman who's she's trying to decide whether she's met this young man and he wants to marry her and take her to, I think it's Argentina or someplace like that. And she's excited to get away, but then she also is attached to her home, but she's living with her dad because her mom had died, and her dad is showing the early signs of becoming like an old abusive drunk. Right. And so there's a flashback to her mother on her deathbed. Her mother has gone crazy before dying, and she says this phrase, Deravon Saran, and she keeps repeating it. And it's like pseudo Irish. It's a phrase that kind of, and I forget what it sort of sounds like, but it like kind of sounds like maybe a couple different things in Irish, but it doesn't really mean anything. Or maybe it does. It's one of these things that people, write about, like it's something you can sort of theorize about,
Right.
So yeah, that's Dubliners. And he also structured it in a way where the stories fit the stages of life. So the early stories are from the perspective of children, and you get slightly old, young adults, and then finally the very last story is probably the most famous story of the collection, called The Dead. And this deals with social life in a broader sense, but then also, as it says, the dead. And this is kind of an interesting aspect of Joyce that isn't really commented on so much, but he's very famous for his sexuality that he puts in the books. But as I was going back through, preparing for this, I went back, I read Dubliners, Portrait, not all of Ulysses, but kind of a lot of the major chapters in the book. And I was kind of surprised at how death is a fairly constant undertone in a lot of his work.
Yeah, he has a sort of he has a fixation on it, I think, right? And I mean, justly so, I suppose. But yeah, it does kind of run as a theme throughout. And it will even, some of it is kind of presupposed by the structure. There's something about even Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which we'll talk about more, but it's like you start out in basically in infancy or even before that,
like just battling as a baby at the beginning of that one, if I recall.
But even like there's something about doing that indicates like, oh well, then this person's gonna die. To me, there's like, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's like
no, right, sort of the perfect circularity of everything.
Yeah,
we turn to where we were and everything. Yeah,
yeah. So
isn't that? Go ahead, Aldous.
Yeah. Well, he's interested in all the stages of life and all the aspects of life, and death is actually one of those. And specifically, he is interested in the way the memory of the dead is with living people, all the time. So
that's a theme in The Dead. And the Dead is a masterful short story. I mean, that whole book, Dubliners, is pretty great. But
wait, so he turns into this agricultural journal. He sends the Farmer's Almanac for Ireland, a short story that's about a couple of sisters. Like what?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that, so I don't remember that story.
Okay, that's right.
Well.
Did he get a pound? Yeah. Did he get
his
money?
He did.
Oh, good. Okay, he's a professional writer.
Yes. They published the next few stories of his actually, and then at some point it came to be like, listen, these are good, but this is like not what we do. You know what I mean? Like we've got like old ladies sitting in farmhouses. They're looking for like, how can we melt down our wax into a new candle? And here you are, like,
And Joyce was like, look, this is not what anybody does.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no wonder. No one wants this. Of course you don't want it. And I find it perfect that his first collection he decides to name Dubliners. That name came along later and was probably proposed by his brother Stanislaw. But like you were saying, Dublin, he leaves Dublin, Joyce does, but he never really leaves it. He's completely preoccupied by Dublin means something to him deeper than geography. Even the places he would live, he favored them in their relationship to Dublin.
So this attitude that he has toward Dublin, is it that he thinks it's provincial? Is it that he thinks it's backwards, or is it something else?
It's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of it's interesting. So he flip-flops between sort of despising the Irish character and loving the Irish character.
Which is a very Irish
thing to do. Yeah. He resented Catholicism, but in the same token, he would criticize the Pope for not being Christian enough. He had a complicated relationship to everything that he resented. He was also hypersensitive to the point of paranoia about betrayal, right? And I think you can get a sense of this if you're born. I have a little bit I want to do on the context of being in Ireland at Joyce's time that I think will help. I think it might be interesting to people if they don't know much about Irish history. And I think it also helps us understand why he might have this love-hate, sensitivity, resentment, and also understanding of Ireland. So he's born in 1882, as we said. And I'm not going to go super far back, but I want to just give us enough to kind of get where he's at now. About 80 years before Joyce's birth, after centuries of struggle and conquest and revolution and enslavement and religious conversion and war and chaos ultimately in Ireland, the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland were merged to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which sounds nice. It's like, oh, we're all going to be friends now, right? We're all going to work together. But that's not how it actually worked. The English, and people would probably push back at this, and I'm trying to paraphrase and I'm losing a lot of details, but the English at that time, after that time, kind of used Ireland as their breadbasket. It was like, we'll industrialize and become a sophisticated society, and you'll just grow us crops, and then it'll all work out fine, right? And I'm not speaking specifically about Dublin here, but Ireland in general. And because of that, there was a perspective from English society that the Irish are all, backwards and uneducated, mostly because they never sent them any money to get educated.
And then there's the Catholicism business as well.
Well, and that's big too. The English the English sort of didn't trust the Irish because of how Catholic they were, right? They always were. They were Papists, right? So they were never quite.
And this, of course, is Brad Kelly giving you the you this, the lowdown.
Yeah. Hey, I'm getting revenge for my ancestors right now.
Yeah, there you go.
So because of this sort of breadbasket city dynamic, the big event in Irish history in the sort of not in Joyce's time, but in the memory of, like, Joyce would have had family members he knew the names of who were involved in this, was the Great Famine of 1845 to 1851. Sure. Partially this was a result of a potato blight. But really, there was a potato blight, but there was also an enforcement of monocultural agriculture by the English. It was like, you guys have to just grow potatoes. That's all you can grow. Again, I'm exaggerating. That's all you can grow. Oh no, there's a potato blight. Well, I guess now you guys starve. That was sort of the thing. It was like they'd been forced to grow this one crop. That crop got a disease. When everybody started to die and starve and flee the country, the English said, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, guys. Like, what's your problem? Well, just because you're lazy and you like to fight and drink, you can't handle this situation? That was sort of the attitude.
Yeah. Where is your God now?
Right. And then as things went back, it was like, see, the Irish were everything we said that they were. Right. So that was kind of in Joyce's, like I said, 1845 to 1851. You lost, due to death and emigration, I should say, there was about 3 million people. The population of Ireland went down by about 3 million people.
That is remarkable. That is not that big of an island.
It's not. When your biggest city by heads and shoulders is 400,000 people, to lose 3 million people in a fairly small geographic area, the population of Ireland didn't recover until like the 60s. Some of the counties until the 2000s.
These are my people too on my mother's side as well. Yeah. So this podcast is representing the Hibernian threat. We are showing our hand here.
Yeah. So now that's all before Joyce is born, but when Joyce is born, this has led to a rise in Irish nationalism and a kind of a push for Irish independence. We still see this, like, this exists at least into our memory and things like the Irish Republican Army and all of that.
The crying game.
Yeah. It's all still kind of there, and it's just gradually fading is all.
It's still very much in play too, though. I mean, if you spend time in Great Britain, it's very much alive, and of course you have it's a whole thing. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And so one other thing. So now to place Joyce in this, Joyce's family was politically what you would call a home rule family. They were generally in favor of Irish independence of one stripe or another. There were a lot of sort of sectarian arguments about what form that should take, what steps are okay to take in order to get there, right? You've got sort of peaceniks versus like, well, let's just kill everybody attitudes. There's definitely a little bit of both of those. But so that's kind of happening in Joyce's life. he resented though. So he was generally in favor. His a family hero was this guy Charles Parnell, who was one of the most outspoken voices for home rule. And the Joyce family, I think I read that the Joyce family had a picture of Parnell in their living room, right? So this was ever present in their minds, and Joyce had a relationship to it. Later on, I think he would say like he didn't respect the violent revolutionary aspects of it either. But it was sort of like, well, you want it to be out from under the English thumb, and you also don't want to take any of the steps. It's like, where do you actually fit into all of this? What's your, you just kind of don't want to, you kind of don't want anything. But I think what you see there in Joyce's whole, leaving Dublin is like, if he didn't leave Dublin or didn't leave Ireland, he was always going to be part of this dynamic. There's no way to, is a loop that had no exit point unless you literally left the country. And also,
I have a pretty good quote that's related to this subject, and it's from A Portrait of the Artist. Not to skip forward too much here, but I think it's relevant to Dubliners actually. To read Dubliners in this light. And it's Stephen Dedalus, the hero, who is essentially the young James Joyce, who's the hero of Portrait. But he says, when the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. And he's talking to one of his young student friends, a close friend of his. But everybody around him is caught up in national revival, Irish identitarianism, right? And Joyce, although he wasn't in favor of the British rule, he had as you were laying out there, a really ambivalent or ambiguous relationship to all of these things and all of these institutions. But so Portrait is about the attempt of an individual to fly by the nets. Dubliners is just about the nets.
Right. No, that's really well put. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, there's Joyce's attitude towards Ireland at the sort of socio-political or the political level somewhat, but there's also his resentment of the Catholic Church. And then he also had an issue kind of with the people, to be honest. There's one thing, he thought of Irish virtues as a fraud. Like the whole, he wouldn't get married to Nora for a long time, and they kind of were slightly deceitful with their families about that. But he thought all that was nonsense anyway. And he was that way about a lot of like social rules and conventions. So he thought their virtues were a fraud. He thought that their sort of high-minded moralism was essentially cruelty. And there's a quote from the Richard Ellman biography, which is fantastic, that he thought of their purity, so-called purity, was really a masquerade for a timid onanism. Which I loved. So
she was going to replace with a bold onanism.
Yeah, you just put it right on the page. Right.
Yeah, quite good.
Yeah, he had no time or patience for purity whatsoever. That wasn't. I mean, that's one of the difficulties he had in getting things published and whatnot.
This business about identitarianism and everything, how germane is that now? That line about the net rings just as much true now as it did then, I imagine.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
Different ways, yeah. But they certainly want to sort of trap your identity in amber as a creator, as a writer. You're not what you make. You're the whole of what you are, and it's very invasive and confessional now. In a way where there's a sort of like kind of maudlin quality to what they expect. Right, you have to splay your guts out, and it's not enough just to give people art. You have to give yourself away too, somehow.
And I think, and that's a good point. I think this is never quite. Maybe it is, but I don't see it quite laid out on the page so much. But I kind of get this sense from him that he wouldn't. Part of the reason he would resist being Irish and being Catholic was he didn't want to have to identify as an Irish Catholic. Like he wanted to be James Joyce. And so
Right.
just because he happened to be Irish and he happened to be Catholic, none of that matters. So I think that's a part of the reason he pushed against that stuff so hard.
It's much like Sarah Kane in that
Yeah.
episode. There's the letter where she talks about how there is no such thing as a woman writer. I
Right.
am Sarah Kane.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Let me give you, I want to give a little more context. Just we're still trying to understand who this guy is. So I've got a description of his father. His father was a total character, and I kind of love him and hate him.
Why am I not surprised at all?
Right. So let me give you this description of him. It's not super long. Now there are issues with him. He wasn't. You might not call him a good man ultimately, but he was an interesting guy, and James loved him. And this is about John Joyce from the Richard Ellman biography. This reckless, talented man, convinced that he was the victim of circumstances, never at a loss for a retort, fearfully sentimental and acid by turns, drinking, spending, talking, singing, became identified in his son James's mind with something like the life force itself. His expressions, such as "with the help of God and a few policemen," or "like a shot off a shovel," or "twixt you and me, Catarish," and the like, echo in James's books. He appeared in them more centrally, in fact, than anyone except their author. In the early stories, in Dubliners, The Sisters, and Araby, he is considerately disguised as an uncle. In the later stories, besides contributing to Farrington, he is also in Henchy, Hines, Kernan, and Gabriel Conroy. In a portrait of an artist, he is Simon Dedalus, described by his son Stephen as having been a medical student, an oarsman, a tenor, an amateur actor, a shouting politician, a small landlord, a small investor, a drinker, a good fellow, a storyteller, somebody's secretary, something in a distillery, a tax gatherer, a bankrupt, and at present a praiser of his own past. So that's the kind of dude. That's the kind of dude his dad was. He's kind of a man of chaos a little bit, and the mother's side was different from that. She was more from a musical family.
He sounds like he was down the pub.
Oh yeah,
on the reg.
Yeah.
Kind of every night we take a little stroll.
He would tip him back for sure. And as time went on, he became abusive and angry and sort of disdainful about what had happened to him. He had participated in local politics. A relative of John Joyce's was actually the Lord Mayor of Dublin in James's lifetime. And they had unseated somebody from a committee or something, some old timers, somebody from like the Guinness, because the Guinnesses were very involved in Irish politics at that time. And because of John Joyce's work, he had been given a lifetime role as a tax collector, which was a good paying job and allowed him to kind of go around and glad hand people and seem like he was important. And eventually he would have that job stripped from him in the shifting dynamics of Dublin politics, right? And after that, it was just gradual dissolution.
Man, this is a sidebar, but boy, what would you give to be part of the Guinness dynasty?
Right?
Talk about a fun family.
Yeah, for sure.
Just the name, right? That's pretty fun.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess one thing we'll talk about, I do want to get more into Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, because it's a great book. But I'm thinking there's a couple more things I want to hit, because there's a really big moment also in 1904 when James and Nora leave Ireland.
He's very young still then, right?
Oh yeah, I mean he's 22 years old. Yeah, okay. He's a young guy. He's out of college. He did go to university. He studied
Trinity?
English, French. No, I don't even know. I am not sure if he went to University College, which was I'm not even sure if that's the same. It might be the same thing. I think Trinity eventually took over University College or something like that.
All right.
Yeah. So he did fairly well in school, though he was a little bit of one of those guys who only paid attention to what he wanted to pay attention to. But he was
the best. Those are the best guys.
Well,
Kubrick, the D student. I love that.
Yeah, this is the thing you have to establish. Like, whether you think Ulysses is a great novel or not, right? Whether you actually like his writing or anything, there is no way to question the fact that his IQ was, just raw intelligence, verbal intelligence was about as high as you can get without your brain exploding, right? You know what I mean? So he did extremely well in college. In fact, up until a couple of years after college, the only money he ever really made was when he would win some academic competitions as a grade school boy. They would have like these tests they would give, and he would win them, and he would get, £5 or something. So he might have been like the smartest guy in Ireland, for all we know, or very close to it. So yeah, he went to university, and in 1902 1904 he and Nora, who fell into a pretty intense relationship really quickly, would move out of Ireland in October of 1904, and essentially never move back. They would take a couple visits, Nora more than James, but once they were abroad, they were abroad. That was their thing. James wanted to leave. James was sort of driven by two or three things or more. One is he didn't want to be in Ireland, and the other was he thought that his destiny was to venture out and have this sort of artistic life, right? He wanted to fight off all conventions, and so if he went someplace else, he could reinvent himself. Now that, I think, Aldous, tell me if I'm wrong, I think Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man ends when Daedalus moves out of Ireland. Is that right?
Yeah, well, he's about to. He's
okay.
The last lines of the book are basically his declaration to, go abroad and live this life. So exactly as you laid it out there.
Yeah, and this is the thing. Nothing James wrote. Well, it's all fiction, right? But everything is drawn from real life. All the characters are drawn from real life. Almost all of the events are drawn from real life. All of the places are. Now, Finnegan's Wake, it gets a little more complicated because you're saying, well, okay, what's a real influence? But through Ulysses anyway, it's pretty much all drawn from real people. He would even write home to aunts and uncles and say, can you go down to such and such street and tell me, is the boot shop next door to the candle shop? Or is it the hardware store that's next to the boot store? Like that level of detail.
That is so fascinating. Yeah. I never would have guessed that he was writing these things while he was away, given the attention to detail. That is, I find that fascinating.
Right. Yeah, there's a section of Ulysses, to just briefly jump ahead to that, that he wrote basically looking at a map in Dublin, and I think I read that he also had like a stopwatch, and I don't know how he like recreated this exactly, but it was very important for him to know. This is the Wandering Rocks episode for people who have read it, how long it took to walk from place to place in this area that he was writing about. So.
Yeah. Well, especially if you're going to write a novel of that density that's all set in one day, you've got to be. And he actually was very, very concerned that these things were. It's hard to describe. So Ulysses is this crazy book. People can't read it, so on and so forth. But he was very concerned that it could happen, that the factual details of the world either did or could happen.
He was his own continuity man for the film. Nothing must be out of place. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Accurate.
He wrote another relative asking. There's a scene in Ulysses. I don't remember the details, but he wrote asking anyway, like, I know there's a gate in this park. Do you think an average person could climb that gate? Like, just to get. Whereas me, I write stories. I would just make it a gate someone can climb. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Get this in.
It's like Joyce wanted to be able to literally step into these books and live in them when he was done writing them.
Yeah. I think you're right. Well, so maybe this is a good time to kind of dig more into Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Portrait is generally what you would call a Bildungsroman, right? It's and that's the novel of the education of a young man, the formation of their mind. It's actually a more specific subcategory called a Künstlerroman. I don't know. I guess this is a very big German genre.
Yeah, wunderbar, Künstlerroman.
German names for these. But although in the normal version of it translates as artist's novel. Usually what happens is they have these ambitions to be like a special important artist, and by the end they settle for being just a common person. It very much does not happen in Portrait of the Artist. Right. So Portrait is the story of Joyce's author insert here, Stephen Dedalus. He's not probably identical to Joyce, but he's fairly close, as close as we're going to get. And so this is Stephen Dedalus, and you might recognize the last name there as being drawn from the Greek mythic constructor of the labyrinth and the builder of the wax wings for Icarus, Daedalus. So that's, very symbolically appropriate. He was speaking before of the attempt to forge wings in order to fly past the nets set by Dublin, this labyrinth for Joyce. And actually might be worthwhile to just read the beginning of it to give you a sense of what he does with the style here, because so each book that Joyce wrote, the 4 major works, are like a revolution in form, and he does one thing and then he never goes back to it. He just keeps developing and just like exploding out the possibilities of literature. So he has the collection of short stories, Dubliners, and then he moves on to his novel, which he's going to point forward to what's going to happen with the modernist novel. So let me just read the first page of how Portrait opens up. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tuckoo. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was Baby Tuckoo. The moo cow came down the road where Betty Byrne lived. She sold lemon platt. Oh, the wild rose blossoms on the little green place. He sang that song. That was his song. Oh, the green woth botheth. When you wet the bed, first it is warm, then it gets cold. His mother put on the oil sheet. That had the queer smell. His mother had a nicer smell than his father. She played on the piano the sailor's hornpipe for him to dance. He danced. Tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la, tra-la-dee, tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la. So this is a different way for a book to open up.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and it's not really the stream of consciousness density that I think people might expect out of Joyce, and it's not the kind of work that was coming before him either. There's and it's purposely done, but I always thought, I remember reading that and knowing this was sort of early on in his career, of the bravery of writing, like, this is what I'm going to write. I'm going to write borderline baby talk.
Right.
At the beginning of a novel as well. Yeah. Was there anything like it before in literature? Really? I don't know. So. Now, maybe somebody could come up with something, but boy.
Yeah.
So stylistically, what I think is going on here is, so you have what's called free and direct speech, or sometimes free and direct discourse. And it actually goes back to like the early 19th century. Somebody like Jane Austen would do it, where it's kind of a meeting between the narration of the third person narrator and the thoughts of the whoever the character is that is being described, without introducing it, going, he thought to himself, it just kind of throws out the thought there that's in their mind. But this would only be used sporadically and for very short periods of time, or space in the books. And what Joyce does is he essentially writes almost the entire novel in that style. And then second, the other thing that he does is he makes the prose match. Obviously, Stephen is a little child in the beginning here, and as Stephen grows, the complexity of and the type of narration changes along to match his mind. And so, yeah, I think there had never been such a merger between the narration and the mind of the character. And so it's not yet stream of consciousness, that would later be explored by Joyce and several other modernist writers. You guys did an episode on Virginia Woolf, so of course, she was working along the same lines. It's not quite there, but it's pointing towards that.
Yeah, you can see the first kind of scratching the surface of getting towards that. He's merging the form of the work with something a little bit closer to how a human psychology works. Yeah.
What year is that going around?
Portrait is more like 1910.
I think it is.
Something right around there. Yeah.
Now, are we, at this point, influenced by Freud? Is that going around yet?
It's starting to. It's Freud and Joyce and Jung are contemporaries, with them being a bit older than him, but not by a whole lot. And in fact, Joyce would meet Carl Jung actually, and spend some time in the room with him.
Freud is going to be, that episode is going to be wild.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that you bring that up, because Joyce was skeptical of psychoanalysis in general, both the Freudian and the Jungian strains of it. Kind of thought it was ridiculous, but also was like, in a way, in terms of the process of sort of discovering the human unconscious, to me, he feels like he's right in there. He feels almost like a colleague to me.
Without a doubt. And Virginia Woolf too.
Right, and Virginia Woolf as well. And yet he was like, I'm never going to sit in the chair. Like, I don't know what these guys are doing. I don't know why they're doing it. But he's in the sense doing the same thing as them.
I'm trying to put myself into the mindset of somebody who is a literary agent or a literary world person, and you get dumped this, and this is what you begin to read. What must they have made of it? What do you do
with it? Yeah. There was Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man came out of an earlier work that he'd written called Stephen Hero, which is essentially the same, similar story, but not as formally planned out or formally structured. And he tried to get it published in a Irish literary journal that was just starting up. And the way you read it, and it sounds like it's just some people he kind of knew, some other people his age had started something. And he submitted it to them, and they were like, well, we don't even understand what this is. Like, it's nice, I guess, James, but like, I don't know how I can't publish something that doesn't make any sense to me.
Now, were they living in Paris when he was working on this?
No,
where were they living?
I'll get us kind of on track here biographically, because the first place they moved to, it's kind of odd. And here's where we'll get a little bit of the sense of betrayal that Joyce experienced. So he leaves Ireland, and he had paid this woman for a tip about how to, at a teaching position at a Berlitz school in Zurich. Now, I don't know if you guys know, a Berlitz school, it sounds like a very European thing. It actually started in America. It's a franchised language school. The idea was he would go and teach English. So he paid for this tip. He gets to Zurich, and there's no job. And I think this feeds into Joyce's sense of being betrayed by Ireland, right? Like, I was supposed to go here. I was supposed to have a job. It was all lined up. And, you guys hosed me. But they take sympathy. The Berlitz school takes sympathy on him. They send him first to Trieste. Turns out there's no job there either. Then they send him to Pola. They're not there very long, but eventually they do get to the city of Trieste, which is now it's part of Italy. At the time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's on the east. It's the is that the Adriatic that's just west of the boot of Italy? I think that's the Adriatic. It's sort of on the opposite coast, very far north. It's on the west. The shore of the Adriatic, very far to the north. It's now part of Italy, but at the time it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they moved there for James to teach in the Berlitz school. And they'd be there for quite a long time. Now, Joyce, once they get there, he immediately feels kind of trapped, and it takes him a while. Eventually, he sort of comes to have a certain degree of affection for that city, But at the time, he's starting to feel kind of trapped. He's with Nora. He would always love Nora, but this is the thing. It's one of the weirdest matches in all of art history, in my opinion. Nora Barnacle and James Joyce.
Nora Barnacle.
Listen, so she let me read you just a little bit from the Ellman biography to give you a sense of what it was like. Not the sense of what it was like to live with Nora, but a sense for each of them what it must have been like to live with the other one. Because so here you've got James Joyce, who's going to essentially reinvent literature in a certain way, and I don't think that's unfair to say. But this is Nora early on in their relationship. Joyce's writing baffled her. The thought that sentences could be framed with varying degrees of skill was new to her and on the whole unacceptable. Joyce read her a chapter of his novel, that'd be Portrait, but noted impatiently in a letter to his brother, "She cares nothing for my art." When he copied his epiphanies from a notebook into his new chapter, she asked frugally, "Will all that paper be wasted?" He set her to read Mildred Lawson, the first story in Moore's Celibates, which ends with a woman ruminating in bed, almost as inconclusively as Ulysses or a story in Dubliners, and she complained, "That man doesn't know how to finish a story." She didn't get what he was doing at all. In fact, at one point, they were sort of arguing, and she wrote him, this might have been back in Dublin, she wrote him a letter sort of apologizing, and it was very affectionate. And he knew that she had taken it out of a letter writing book. Like you could buy a book that would give you phrases, and she took it out of that, and she didn't think anything of it. She was like, "This is nice, so why don't I just put this in there?" And he was
There's
enraged.
a Seinfeld episode that uses that as a
really?
plot point. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Right.
I remember that one.
My dearest, it pains me to write this letter, but I must confess. Yeah, this boilerplate template, right. Like a lawyer grabs something.
Yeah, so she sent him a letter like that, and he was just like, "Don't
that must
ever
have
do
really
that again."
Bothered him,
right?
As a writer, like, wow, yeah,
right. So she didn't get it. She never got it. She literally never got it until he was in the grave, and then was like, "You know what? I think he might have been a big deal." Like that's how long it took. So she was this is the thing about Nora. She was a very, I think she was smart. I think she was witty. She wasn't particularly well educated. She was from the country. She was from Galway. It was a town of 4,000 people. You know, she hadn't had much school. She was as young as he was. They were just an odd match. You know, they just they didn't have anything in common.
But if you subscribe to the Patreon, you will see patreon.com/artofdarkpod. You will see there was a certain tie that binds that kept them together, I think.
Yeah. There was. Couple other things on the Nora point, and then I want to bring in what I think is the darkest, not the darkest thing about Joyce's circumstances. This is Art of Darkness after all, but the darkest thing that James ever did, and it stretches out for years. But one thing we got to hit on Nora because it comes up in The Dead, his great short story at the end of Dubliners. Before she met James, Nora in her hometown of Galway, and this might have been why she left Galway to move to Dublin, she'd had a suitor who she'd quite liked named Sonny Bodkin. Sonny Bodkin was, a handsome guy from town, but he was a little nervous and was a little shy. And during the very early part of the courting phase, he died of tuberculosis. And as James kind of learned this, he couldn't bear the thought of the fact that she had loved another, also James couldn't bear the thought that she saw James as just another guy. Like he couldn't handle being sort of lumped in with everybody else. And there was a sort of a sexual component to that as well, right? Like James is very concerned about whether or not she had relations with Sonny Bodkin. Right?
We've got a real ego on fire here.
Oh yeah.
This is a hard. Okay. All right. I mean, it is. Yeah. Is this egomania? Is this? He's the eldest son.
Yep. Yeah.
And he's also eldest son, but also a young man. He's very young
he's
still.
young. Yeah. I mean, they
okay.
move abroad. He's 22, 23 when he
Oh my
settle in
God,
Trieste.
he must
He's
have
23
been
years old.
insufferable.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
he was
yeah.
convinced he was a genius. So this is one
Sure.
thing, and we'll back up a little bit. When he was in Ireland, this would have been in like 1900. He just went around pounding on doors of literary figures in Dublin, right? The guy who gave him the guy who gave him the Irish homestead opening. For people who are deep into the modernist literature, this is George Russell.
Yeah.
He just went to George Russell's house 10 o'clock at night and pounded on the door, and was like, "I'm James Joyce."
So after this episode, the three of us, we need to just DM 50 blue checks after this episode.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Swamp him. We're very much in the Wildian, I have nothing to declare but my genius territory.
He's like that. Yeah, for sure. And I think there's something that a guy like Joyce maybe required a little bit of that attitude. It's like, you're this Dublin kid, you kind of, let's give him some credit in the Oppression Olympics. Like being a kid from Dublin with no real family name is kind of rough. It's hard to get your footing in the world especially when you're just as smart and capable as anybody else,
Well, we can talk about this a little bit later, maybe or maybe not, but even after he wrote Ulysses, I think there was a little bit of begrudging of him from some of the English literary establishment people. If you read what Woolf wrote about Joyce, it's kind of she acknowledges his talent, but she kind of just doesn't like him and thinks that he's low class.
Yeah, I got a quote from Woolf here that is great. Woolf described him as underbred, and she called Ulysses the book of a self-taught working man. And also the book of a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples. And it's funny that we put them in like the study of modernist literature. These are like two of the biggest names, at least two of the biggest European names that people kind of pair them up, right?
Salty.
It's Joyce, Woolf, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and then
So do we like the free and direct James Joyce, or do we like the underbred James Joyce? What do we like more for the show title? What do you think?
I like the pimply James Joyce.
The pimply James Joyce.
I'll pick like I always do.
Yeah. So, and one thing on this George Russell, he went to George Russell and pounded on the door. And one thing, this is back in Ireland, even though kind of in our gradual moving forward, we're in Trieste. He got hooked up with Yeats. George Russell introduced him to Yeats via letter, and they met. And James Joyce gave him some poems. Now, Yeats is like a celebrity writer at this time. He's sort of the biggest deal in literary Ireland. And Joyce, being a bit younger, Joyce asks him at one point in this meeting, Joyce is, arrogant as possible. And Yeats is like slightly impressed by him, but also kind of like trying to figure out his deal. And James asks him, well, how old are you? And Yeats tells him he's like 40 or something at that time. And James just kind of shakes his head. This is the legend anyway. James kind of shakes his head and says, yeah, unfortunately, you're too old for me to help you,
Oh, what? Yeah, I love it.
And despite that, Yeats would help him multiple times throughout his life, sort of like a letter here when it really needed to be, a recommendation there. And I think Yeats did have a little bit of that, like, you got moxie, kid. I think there was a little bit of that for sure. So let's do, okay. So now they're abroad. I said I was gonna tell you what I think is the sort of darkest thing, but go ahead.
They were in Trieste, and that is, if you have a map in your mind, you can think of Central Europe. You think of Austria. It's right down below Austria, and it's at the top of sort of where Italy curves over. And you start getting into what is it? If you went down, it'd be sort of the Balkans and everything, correct? So that's a long way from Dublin.
It's a long way from Dublin, and he kind of just ended up there because that's where he had an opportunity, and he ended up liking it. Partially, I think he liked it because there was he saw it a little bit like Dublin in that it was in character Italian, but it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was a little bit of that Ireland-England thing going, right? Like the people there weren't really the people that were in charge of the place. So he had a little bit of that. Now, flash forward a little bit. So Giorgio, Nora and James's son, is born in 1905. James is teaching at this Berlitz school, and all good, all well and good. Now, the problem is James is terrible with money for a number of reasons. He's a big tipper. They eat out every night. He always needs to have furniture. He's always buying books. He's always wanting to go to shows when he can. And also he drinks a lot, right? Especially at this time, but actually all throughout his life. So he has this, they have Giorgio, which I think is funny. He gives the kid basically an Italian name. Giorgio would go by George when he was old enough to choose. Giorgio was born July 27, 1905. And James realizes that this is a problem. He is not making enough money. He comes up with a bunch of schemes to try and make money. One of them is importing Irish tweed, right? He's going to import some tweed jackets from Ireland and try and sell them. And apparently he did do that a few times.
Sounds like a Joycean thing to do.
Yeah, right, right. He thinks about he might try and revisit his singing career, which we didn't talk about a little bit just for the sake of time, but he apparently had a beautiful tenor voice. And had been in some singing competitions and had been in some concerts and things, and probably could have made a go of it as a professional singer at some level. So he thought maybe he would try to do that. He once submitted he solved a puzzle in a London magazine and sent the results in for a 250-pound prize, which he apparently would have won, but it was delayed because of the post. Now, for reference, 250 pounds at that time is like $15,000 to $20,000. Like, it's no joke, right?
Yeah.
You know, when you're hard up and you just had a kid, like that's 20 grand is
you don't need to tell me that, Brad.
Right.
artofdarkpod.com /support.
That's right. So none of these schemes work to make money. So James hits on another one. He's going to get his younger brother, Stanislaw, to come and move to Trieste, and they'll all share expenses, right? Now, backing up a little bit, Stanislaw is the younger brother. He had always worshipped James, and like actually a lot of the kids in the neighborhood back home kind of did. Clearly, he was a wit. He was funny. He would dance, and he was a good singer. You know, so people generally liked him. James had basically never shown any respect to his little brother Stan whatsoever. Stan had tried to share some of his own writing with James, and James had basically called him dumb. You know, like here, James, here's something that I wrote. Well, that's boring and dumb.
Oh,
like
ouch!
That level of sort of just no compassion whatsoever. And yet, James decides he's going to reach out and say, hey, little brother, why don't you come to Trieste? You know, this will be great. You can get a teaching job here. I'll hook you up with a teaching job, and you can live with us, and it'll be fantastic. Stanislaw does it partially because he loves his brother and he wants to be close to his brother, partially because he feels a similar thing like James, that you have to get out of Dublin if you're ever going to make something of yourself. All fine and good, except that the day that he shows up in Trieste, James borrows money from him. And he basically...
Wait, so he shows up and his brother borrows money from him?
Yeah. He shows up and he's like, Stan, we can't eat tonight.
This sounds incredibly like a Dubliner's story. This is absolutely how a Dubliner's story would have ended.
Yep. Right? Yeah. And the thing is, he never stopped borrowing money from him, like until World War I. Basically, he is constantly borrowing money from Stanislaw. Stanislaw is paying off his debts. James is drinking recklessly, like he would stay out all night drinking up all their money, drinking up all Stan's money. It got to the point, and he's living in the same flat with Nora and Giorgio, right? It got to the point that Stanislaw would regularly, James would show up drunk in the middle of the night and Stan would beat him up. Like, you can't do this kind of thing. Like, what are you doing? You're ruining, like, in anger, would pummel him. to the point that like James would have to figure out schemes to like lure him out of the house and then sneak in so that he could like get to his bedroom without getting
the pimply, pummeled, underbred, free and direct James Joyce.
Yeah.
And wait. So what I'm hearing, Brad, is that you're telling me that a groundbreaking writer, a genius, has a slight bit of a drinking problem.
Yes, he does. Yeah. He and this part is kind of sad though. I really felt for the little brother who is a smart guy and a fairly talented writer. He wasn't James Joyce, but I mean, who is? And he wrote back to their father after he'd been there for 5 years. He wrote back to their father and said something along the lines of like, I don't think James has asked me a single question about myself since I got here. 5 years and just handing over money, getting him out of jams, paying the rent. That is
such a terrible personality trait.
It really is.
You meet someone and they don't ever bother to ask you. There's no tennis. The ball doesn't get handed over. That's awful.
It's awful. Rough. And imagine if they did it for 5 years while you were paying their rent.
Coming home drunk. Sounds like love.
Yeah, for real. So,
sounds like some of the Twitter accounts that I follow. I sort of imagine. Not you, Aldous. Not you.
Yeah.
No. Aldous, no, not at all. And just for people to want to find you, you're at Forest of Symbols on.
No, it's actually at Aldous Asterion.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. But the podcast, just to give you your plug here in the middle of it, podcast is Forest of Symbols. Where can people find that?
Yeah, you can look up the Forest of Symbols wherever you get podcasts. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also, there is a Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/symbolpod. I do some extra things on there. I've been reviewing some books or kind of giving a spiel on some books I've been reading lately. I did a post on Finnegan's Wake recently. Which I had time to do more on that. But yeah, there is some extra stuff on there. So, but I would say if you've never heard the Forest of Symbols, listen to it first, and then if you like that, think about going on the Patreon as well.
Oh, it's a very you're not interviewing, and you've had some great guests on, by the way.
A couple, huh?
Yeah. Both Kevin and I have been on that show, but there's been some other great guests as well. But your main show is a very Joycean effort, and I don't mean in terms of dense and difficult to understand, but in the I'm not even sure what the sort of lateral connectivity of all things. So it's really
it's
well
funny.
done.
I have yet to directly deal with Joyce, but I would say he's an influence on what I do.
Yeah. It definitely comes across that way for sure. So let me. There's so much Joyce stuff to talk about. I got to read you a little bit from a letter that Joyce wrote during this time in Trieste, still before he's really published anything other than Irish homesteader stuff. Okay, so this is a letter he wrote to Aunt Josephine. He was always writing letters home to people. And that was kind of a hobby, I guess, that most people did at that time, right? That was their social media time. He's trying to get Dubliners published, and he mentions this in this letter. He's actually sent it off to a publisher who he would be in a wrestling match for publication rights and printing problems and things for years. But here he is talking about his sort of life at this time. Nora does not seem to make much difference between me and the rest of the men she has known, and I can hardly believe that she is justified in this. I'm not a very domestic animal. After all, I suppose I am an artist. And sometimes when I think of the free and happy life with which I have or had every talent to live, I am in a fit of despair. At the same time, I do not wish to rival the atrocities of the average husband, and I shall wait till I see my way more clearly. I suppose you will shake your head now over my coldness of heart, which is probably only an unjust name for certain perspicacity of temper or mind. I am not sure that the thousands of households which are with difficulty held together by memories of dead sentiments have much right to reproach me with inhumanity. To tell the truth, in spite of my apparent selfishness, I'm a little weary of making allowances for people. I just think there's something, so he feels stuck, and people, oh, he's making allowances for people. Meanwhile, literally his brother is paying his bills. He's got a child. He's taken this woman from Ireland without marrying her, which doesn't seem like a big deal now, but like,
yeah,
it was to convince her to it be okay that they weren't actually married.
There was a bit of a stigma to that in Catholic Dublin in turn of the century.
Yeah. Oh yeah, when she would visit home later, they did get married eventually because James was concerned about being able to pass on his inheritance to his children if they weren't married. But later on, she would go home to Ireland to visit family, and she would ask him if she could wear a ring, just for like appearance's sake. Like, I don't want to have the conversation, right? Can I just wear a ring? And he said, you cannot wear a ring. Like, I refuse to allow you to wear a ring. He was that much against like the idea of marriage. Which is, can you imagine the cruelty?
Hardcore. He was an edgelord.
He was an edgelord
of Dublin.
Yeah.
Serious edgelord, especially as we get into Ulysses.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I wanted to say too, he's teaching in Trieste, and I think he actually apparently was a pretty well-liked teacher. I mean, he was a character, right? And he also had a lot of talent for languages. There's some things that he would give, some things that have survived, which were translation lessons that he gave his students. Then a couple of them I think are funny and really kind of tell you something about his mind. Here's one of them. So he would give this to students, most of whom were adults. They were like businessmen or whatever who were trying to learn English. This is one of them. That woman has a nice small breast, but her conscience is as wide as a sewer. Her husband is happy because her boyfriends are helping to develop her good points. I'm developing myself too. Go you and do likewise. Sop up 14 shots of absinthe on an empty stomach and you'll see. If this cure doesn't develop you, why, you're hopeless. You may as well give up trying to learn English according to this method. I don't know why he would tell him to translate. It seems bizarre, right? But it's like a whole little Joycean. Here's another one. Ireland is a great country. It is called the Emerald Isle. The metropolitan government, after centuries of strangling it, has laid it waste. It's now an untilled field. The government sowed hunger, syphilis, superstition, and alcoholism there. Puritans, Jesuits, and bigots have sprung up. So that's a little bit of what he thinks about Ireland.
I mean, that just sounds like a tweet storm.
It does.
He's had a few too many. He's going to let you know what he thinks about the state of the nation.
Right. Here's another one. Dubliners, strictly speaking, this is the people, not the book. Dubliners, strictly speaking, are my fellow countrymen, but I don't care to speak of our dear, dirty Dublin as they do. Dubliners are the most hopeless, useless, and inconsistent race of charlatans I've ever come across on the island or the continent. This is why the English Parliament is full of the greatest windbags in the world.
Do you think he's giving them additional context, or do you think that they're imbibing this as if it's God's truth?
Not sure. I mean, when I think it's important to remember that the vast majority of people he was teaching were adults, because this is a language school. This isn't like public school, right?
Sure,
These are people who already have educations and things. So there's probably a little bit of a wink and a nudge and a haha, James, you're so crazy kind of thing. I would imagine. Right. Yeah.
There is that sort of expatriate style where you absolutely savage the place that you're from, right? I've left this place. They're all backwards, and here we know better. Yeah. But those are very funny too. I appreciate the sense of humor.
Yeah, he's certainly a wit. So also in this time, he spends a lot of time in Trieste trying to get Dubliners published, as we mentioned. And it did not. It was surprising how poorly it went. He had this guy Grant Richards who was willing to publish it, and the process early on was kind of like, okay, this is great, we'll publish it, but can you make like a little tweak here? This is a little bit offensive, and that's kind of dirt. We can't say, And Joyce at first would kind of like, I don't want to say he just catered to it, but every once in a while he would say, yeah, okay, that's not maybe that big of a deal, and then they start to accumulate. It's like at one point somebody asks you to change one word and you're like, that's fine. And then you get pushed an inch and they take a mile, and it gets kind of worse and worse. At one point they send a story to the printer, Grant Richards does. And Grant Richards hadn't even read this one. and the printer pushed back and said, I can't publish this. This is
the
obscene.
printer.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
no.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So he had all kinds of problems like this, and Joyce would eventually start to get kind of litigious about it. But the funny thing is, like, none of it is all that, like, the stuff that's obscene to us, you would put it on family primetime television. The stuff that he like, I don't know, Aldous, do you remember any of the things specifically? Like, what is the dirtiest thing that happens in Dubliners?
In Dubliners?
Yeah.
There isn't much, really.
Right.
Although there's some indirect stuff. Like, there's a story called An Encounter, and it's about these boys, young schoolboys, and they're skipping class for the day. They decide to play hooky, and they run into an old man in the park. And, you know, on a work day, an old man who's in the park is not going to be a very,
that's true.
You know, he's going to be some kind of nefarious character. And there's, you know, he starts talking to them, and he's a little bit weird, and then he goes away. And then you hear one of the boys saying, "Oh, look what he's doing." And then they all try to get away, and
but they don't say what he's doing. Right.
So I don't know exactly what.
And
oh my God! Oh, that old man is starting a podcast. It's disgusting.
Just squatting in the corner.
We can't have this. Is that a blue Yeti?
But there was another story called Ivy Day in the Committee Room that was fairly political, and I think that was a little bit sensitive as well. It had to do with the King's visit to Ireland. And the issue of Parnell too, who was somewhat controversial.
Right, controversial, yeah. Joyce would actually eventually, he got into such arguments about the Ivy Day story that he would write a letter to the King of England, basically asking, "Is this offensive? Or you know, can they publish this, or are you offended by it?" And the king didn't write back. You know, it wasn't like the king was sitting there waiting for a letter from James Joyce, but he was looking for ways to try and make this happen, basically. And it took years. Dubliners didn't come out until, I don't know if I've got that handy. It was like 1912 when it came out.
Well, I don't want to put this censorship too far in the past either, because you think forward to, what was it? Was it called the Hays Code, the moral code that Hollywood had to sort of obey, and the Catholic Church was heavily involved in that. And then you think about I Love Lucy and the twin beds and the whole. We're not that far away from that stuff. And of course, we have our new regime of censorship as
which
well.
Is different. The standards are different, but just as strict in some ways.
SSDD.
Right.
Yeah.
SSDD. What does that mean? Oh, you probably can't say.
Right. Can't say.
So you know, one thing. He's trying to he becomes a little bit of a known quantity in Trieste just because he's such an interesting character, and plus he's out drinking all night, right? So you start to make some friends that way, whether they're good or not. And this is one more thing about Ireland. So to make a little bit of money, he gets a job for an Italian language newspaper to write stories about Ireland, and they're actually quite popular in Trieste. So this is part of his becoming a kind of a local, I don't want to even say celebrity, but a local character that people know. And there's a great quote he says. This was actually after the articles. He was asked to deliver a lecture at a university there in Trieste. And this is something he said about Ireland, just hitting on this thing we're talking about, his relationship to the country. The economic and intellectual conditions that prevail in Ireland do not permit the development of individuality. The soul of the country is weakened by centuries of useless struggle and broken treaties, and individual initiative is paralyzed by the influence and admonitions of the church, while its body is manacled by the police, the tax office, and the garrison. No one who has any self-respect stays in Ireland, but flees afar as though from a country that has undergone the visitation of an angered Jove. So this is important to think about in terms of his relationship to people who remained in Ireland. Is he I don't think he actually respected you if you stayed in Ireland. There's a certain if you're dumb enough to stay there, then that should happen to you a little bit. So anyway, a little bit more of his headspace.
I'm trying to think of if there's anything in the United States that we could remotely compare Dublin to when you think about London and the UK, and Ireland is really on the far reaches of Europe. It's like right on the edge, and just an interesting thing. And that chip on his shoulder, and then of course, the language is English that he's writing in, so there's that kind of quality of being a bit of an outsider. I mean, I think
you can certainly understand. You can certainly understand the resentment. I think you can certainly understand the resentment of the English. What's interesting is to turn that into the resentment on the Irish too. That's a kind of that's
everybody has enough resentment to go around.
That's right. Yeah, it's not hard, right? So 1907, their daughter Lucia is born. I love that he gave them both Italian names. They used to speak the Triestine dialect of Italian at home. Actually, that was the first language that the kids learned. Interestingly, he named her Lucia. Lucia is the patron saint of eyesight. And for those who don't know, one sort of the image a person might have of Joyce, especially in his later life, is either with an eye patch or with very thick glasses, or a combination of the two. He had not only poor eyes in terms of eyesight, but unhealthy eyes in terms of he basically had, we'll get into this now. He basically had chronic conjunctivitis, chronic pink eye, which if anybody knows anything about pink eyes, you don't get chronic pink eye. It doesn't really actually make any sense. Most likely what was going on with Joyce is that he had syphilis and had been kept under wraps. Now, he might have had, the speculation is that he had congenital syphilis, so that he was born with syphilis. But he also, he spent a lot of time in brothels before he met Nora, so it's possible that he picked it up there, right?
As one does,
yeah. So, and we'll maybe touch on this a little bit later. I mean, his eye situation is actually, sounds terrible. He has something like 12 or 15 surgeries over the years on his eyes, up to the point of them cutting parts of his eyes out. He would have recoveries where he was actually blind for days or weeks at a time. He had to look through a magnifying glass for stretches, to read anything. So this was an ongoing thing, and it started around the time or shortly after Lucia was born. Let's see. So Lucia born, yada yada yada. Oh, I want to do a little description. So he made a friend, and then I want to get into Ulysses soon, but I want to hit a couple things first. So just trying to give you guys the audience even more of an image of what Joyce was like to be around. He met one of his students that he became friends with was this guy named, I don't know how to pronounce this, Ettore, Ettore, Ettore Schmitz, who was a well-to-do manager of a company that sold paint to the shipping industry or something, but actually was a pretty talented writer, and Joyce actually respected him as a writer and would later on help him out. But in one of his lessons to Schmitz, Joyce said, "Write me in English a description of me. Describe your teacher." And so this is what this friend of his and writer wrote about Joyce. "When I see Joyce walking on the streets, I always think that he is enjoying a full leisure. Nobody is awaiting him, and he does not want to reach an aim or to meet anybody. No, he walks in order to be left to himself. He does also not walk for health. He walks because he is not stopped by anything. I imagine that if he would find his way barred by a high and big wall, he would not be shocked at the least. He would change direction, and if the new direction would also prove not to be clear, he would change it again and walk on his hands, shaken only by the natural movement of the whole body, his legs working without any effort to lengthen or to fasten his steps. No, his step is really his and of nobody else and cannot be lengthened or made faster. His whole body in quiet is that of a sportsman." There's one other part. "He wears glasses, and he uses them without interruption from the early morning until late in the night when he wakes up. Perhaps he may see less than it is to suppose from his appearances, but he looks like a being who moves in order to see. Surely he cannot fight and does not want to. He is going through life hoping not to meet bad men. I wish him heartily not to meet them." Yeah, I don't know. It seems like an interesting little portrait. I like to imagine James like hustling through the streets. I don't know if you guys went to school with anybody. There's a certain kind of kid in like middle school who between classes, because they're, bullied or whatever, sort of ran to one class to another, sort of like hugged the wall and kind of like tucked in a little bit and sort of hustled from one class to another. I imagine Joyce is a little bit like that, but sort of coming out of it as time goes on.
Yeah.
Since I can't think of anybody, that might have been me.
It might have been me early on too. I don't know.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is like
take a quick break. I'm going to go take a quick break here, Brad. I'll be right back.
You're going to take a break?
I'm just kidding.
I just bashed you. Sorry, bud. toughen up.
Yeah, I'm a genius. Nobody knows. I do love that vision of Joyce is like, and these characters, and it reminds me a bit of Kubrick. This idea that these folks these artists have these complete cathedrals in their minds of what they're going to do and what they're going to accomplish, but of course none of it translates to the normie on the street, much less the family or anyone else.
Yeah, you can't explain that. And there were a lot of things of Joyce, like reading parts of his work to people and then just being like, yeah, that's nice, James. That's really good.
Good job. Well, and there's that worrisome thing for writers where it's like, am I just doing therapy? When does this become something real? Am I mentally ill? I'm talking to it does have the quality of talking to yourself.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
For hours at length. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, it's definitely.
And then there's that like horror when somebody hands you their stuff. You have the same anxiety because you know how, but by and large, I have noticed by and large, people are pretty good about, it's rarely as bad as that.
Right. Thinking about what we want to hit here I think we can get into talking about Ulysses in a moment, but I want to pair it with one of his last trips to Dublin in 1912. He's finally he's finally starting to get some attention, but very, very little so far. Dubliners somebody wants to publish Dubliners, but they keep pushing back. Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man is kind of getting closer to being done in 1912, but he goes back for a visit, partially at the prodding of Nora. He wants to take Giorgio there, but so Nora and Lucia stay behind with Stanislaw, and James goes back. And he runs into a couple of people who he would think of as enemies. One of them is Oliver Gogarty. And for folks who have read Ulysses or are familiar with it, it's Buck Mulligan is the name, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I had so many names in my head. I wanted to make sure I'm not mixing some of them up. So Oliver Gogarty is Buck Mulligan in the novel Ulysses, and Oliver Gogarty is probably a pretty fun guy in a way. He's smart. He'd become a surgeon by this point, but was also a bit of a writer, and had given Joyce a little bit of a hard time on his way out, and we might talk more about that in Ulysses, or maybe not. He's definitely in that book. So Oliver Gogarty kind of forces himself on Joyce when he shows back up. And then there is another character named Cosgrave who Joyce runs into, who's like an old friend, right? And for motivations that I don't fully understand, Cosgrave tells Joyce when they meet in 1912 in Dublin, he says, James, you know how when you and Nora were kind of, courting, you know how she would only come and see you every other night? That's because I was going out with her the other nights. All right, see you later. And so this threw Joyce into just madness. Like Nora also wasn't there, so he's like trying to write her letters, and he's freaking out, and he's losing his mind with jealousy, and he can't stand the fact that she would see him and his friend Cosgrave as interchangeable, essentially. He really kind of almost goes off the deep end, and it's surprising that the relationship even survived this sort of tirade of letters that he sent. But yeah, so this is the kind of thing that would make him feel like Joyce's betrayal is partially, his sense of betrayal about Ireland is partially imagined and partially real, this Cosgrave move, I don't know if Cosgrave's just trying to be a jerk. I don't know if he was jealous because apparently he had tried to date Nora. But I mean, who pulls something like that? You know, it's 8 years later. Like, why would you do that? It's very strange. So these characters and others, and also I think revisiting Dublin in 1912, this really starts to get the wheels in motion on Ulysses, the great book Ulysses. So maybe we can start to kind of set the scene about what is this book and why is it a big deal and why are we talking about it 100 years later?
Sure. Do you want me to give a kind of a plot synopsis as well as I can?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, yes, I think that's probably good, but then also anything about it you want to talk about. I'm still trying to figure out. I read Ulysses. I'm still trying to figure out what I read. So any insight is helpful.
As am I. You know, I think I mentioned this earlier, but like the depths are just like, it feels like it's infinite. So in preparation, I was just like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? Eventually you just gotta say what you think you know about this. But anyways, the plot as I understand it, it's about this man, Leopold Bloom, and a day in his life. He is a middle-aged Jewish advertising canvasser, which basically means that he sells ads for the newspaper door to door, more or less. And this is good because it gives him the opportunity to talk to a lot of people throughout the day. And he wanders through Dublin. The day in question is June 16th, 1904, as you mentioned earlier. And interesting to note, I didn't think about this when I didn't learn this until recently, and it makes the novel make more sense. But that particular day was a half work day. So it allows for a lot more things to be happening, because you think like, you know, there's not a lot of people working. There's like a parade that happens. He goes to a funeral. He's eating and drinking in pubs.
It is a very busy day.
It's a very busy day. The whole time he is trying to not think about his imminent cuckolding by an Irish Chad by the name of Blazes Boylan. It's great.
This is a great name.
Great Joycean name there. And it's interesting you mentioned that that like casual dropping of infidelity, because it's actually a pretty strong theme in Ulysses.
Yeah.
As Bloom is wandering, he a couple of times almost runs into Stephen Dedalus, who we met is the hero of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And finally, he does meet him toward the end of the day in a maternity hospital where a mutual acquaintance is having a baby. And Stephen is there because a friend is like an intern or a doctor or someone there. Can't remember exactly, but it's kind of odd. It's a maternity hospital, but there's a bunch of young men there drinking,
hanging out.
It's an Irish birth, I guess. A bunch of people drinking outside while the woman is in labor. But this is symbolically important because another background that's going on here is that since Paddy Dignam's funeral, Bloom's been thinking about his son Rudy, who died in infancy, and Stephen, recently back from Paris, and you kind of gave the biographical background to that, what happened with Joyce. It's the same situation with Stephen. His mother was dying. He refused to kneel and pray for her, and he does feel, even though his principles wouldn't let him do it, he does feel guilty, and he has been thinking about his dead mother. When they do finally cross.
Sounds like he's got a little bit of chop.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah.
So maybe you can pick up there a little bit, Brad.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think I can't really do the summary necessarily. But we're
talking about a day in the life in Dublin. We were talking about how the Irish are indolent and lazy, and they have They have a half day. Of course,
Yeah.
I'm joking. I
Right.
love that my Irish brothers and sisters, my cousins in the old country. But that is so interesting. And then, of course, his Jewishness too is very
Yeah.
unusual.
Joyce.
Yeah, Aldous, are you back? You had a little bit of a choppy connection there.
Yeah. Can you hear me
Oh, sorry.
now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You're good.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, it is important that that Bloom is Jewish because anti-Semitism to Joyce was like a mark of a provincial, low-class person, and it's another one of these things that he judges the Irish for.
Yeah.
And
there was, he actually saw sort of a spiritual kinship between the Irish and the Jewish folk, I think, in terms of like a constantly kicked around by history kind of thing, in part.
Yeah, he did. There is that as well.
But I think there was something like, I'm just going to put a Jew in your city and you have to deal with it. Like, yeah. It's interesting.
Well, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to say about that. Like the theme of exile is pretty interesting to Joyce. He thought of himself as an exile. The one play that he wrote is called Exiles.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah. Anyway, I guess some of my plot summary got cut off there, but they do Stephen and Bloom finally meet. Bloom follows Stephen because he sees how drunk he is into a brothel, with the attempt to sort of look out for him. And then you get this long hallucinatory chapter where they meet their greatest fears and desires. They make it out of there, and Bloom, takes him back to his home, makes him hot cocoa. They have a conversation. They urinate together in the yard, which is the ultimate symbol of male bonding, right?
It really is.
Then Bloom goes to sleep next to his wife, Molly, and the book ends on a long interior monologue from Molly. And that's Ulysses.
Yeah, that's
more or less. I mean,
Right.
There's a lot of other things that happen in there, and there's dozens and dozens of minor characters, but that's the plot. That's the book in a nutshell.
Yeah, the characters piled up on top of each other is kind of fascinating, and then you find out in reading the Ellman biography, basically everybody in there is either directly inspired by an actual person or is like some combination of two or three people. I mean, even the prostitutes in the brothel were based on real prostitutes.
Oh,
like down to everybody that appears in the book, you can figure out who they are.
Yeah. Joyce definitely did his research for the night.
This is a write-off.
That's right. right. I'm doing research. Yeah. So that part's really the intense relationship that he had to sort of the truth. And then the book that he produces, which is not that it's not true, but that it's so stylistically insane, really. I mean,
yeah, this is that's the plot. But the point of Ulysses, and the reason it was such a groundbreaking book, is that each chapter opens up a completely new way to write a novel. In a way, the perspective shifts, the style shifts, and there's some sort of conceit that is sort of brought forth, and he's changing what he's changing what he's doing with each chapter. And the what he did with technique, I mean, all of your doorstop novelists that came after him do owe something to Ulysses. I mean, Thomas Pynchon, John Barth, Joyce is definitely a big influence on all those guys.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, Gravity's Rainbow is a very Ulyssian, I don't know if that's the word, very Ulysses influenced work for sure. This even in the way it feels at times, just is how things happen and how one thing leads to another, and also style. So yeah, it's a big it's one of those things where it's sort of like you see these nominations for. There was recently another podcast, Beyond Zero, which I think started out as a Thomas Pynchon sort of podcast and has kind of grown beyond that, where they just had like a World Series of books, and and they take a poll on each of them. And Ulysses, I think, I don't know if it won, but it came out near the top, and it's very interesting to me to see how vital it remains. And at the time, he was writing it. He's living in Trieste. He's got a couple of books that he can't seem to get anybody to pick up. And the fact that he like lived up to his genius with that book a little bit seems significant to me. And it is a thing you read. If you can flip to a page and you read it, it's clearly something. There's clearly a gravity to it. A precision to it, and that's kind of one thing that I always sort of see in Joyce is like it's the most carefully laid chaos I can imagine in a book.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, there's so much going on, and but it's very intricately planned, and like all the different techniques that he rolls out. Like, yes, on one level, there's no question about it, because you've kind of talked about the egotism of Joyce.
Yeah,
there's definitely an element of him showing off. Like he's going to show you what he can do. But I think the techniques they're generally where the form fits the content. He really takes care to do that. Like, just a few examples. The episode early on that's set in a newspaper office is laid out with sections that have titles,
right?
Headlines, and a lot of them are kind of ironic and kind of funny too. He has the episode I mentioned in the maternity hospital is probably the most virtuoso performance, because what he does in that episode is he imitates the style of something like 18 or 20 different writers throughout the history of the English language, and essentially recapitulates the development of English literature.
Wow.
I read Anthony Burgess's book on Joyce recently. He had a great comment on that chapter, which is that Joyce in that chapter envisioned the history of literature as a series of concentric circles with himself as the outer ring, enclosing all of it.
Right. Wow. Yeah, and so there is something interesting about doing that. So, there's many things that are interesting about doing that. To do this intense formal exploration and experiment, but then the setting of it is this very conventional, a little bit grungy. It's just in a maternity ward with some dudes drinking. Right, like he doesn't. Yeah. It's the subject matter and the events are always so unpretentious. All of this sort of great high-minded art, as it were, is happening in the sentences, but not in the subject, which I've always found really compelling.
It's kind of like a high contrast project, isn't it? Right, we're going to make epic a single day in the life of one Jewish fellow in an Irish city. I'm looking at the Wikipedia right now, and I have in front of me a picture of Nichols, Lombard Street, established 1814, excellence in funeral care. And then underneath it says something like, as I passed Nichols the undertakers, Ulysses, James Joyce, whatever. So they have on their sign the fact that they were
part of it.
Ulysses.
I want to go to Dublin so much, just because all the establishments have that on there. It's like, and it's a weird thing. Like you mentioned, it's an epic, but it's like an epic of the everyday. And we haven't even mentioned the Odyssey correspondences, but we'll get into that. But like, the Ulysses tour is like, I want to go see where Leo Bloom ate his gorgonzola sandwich, like.
Right. It's not where some epic battle was fought or some it is literally that.
I do love that.
And so, the reason it's called Ulysses, I mean, this may be the one thing that people who haven't read Ulysses know about it, which is that it's paralleled to Homer's Odyssey. So there's a question of, is he like shrinking down the epic to the level of an ordinary day, or is he like expanding the ordinary day to something epic? And it's like, it's really both. And you know, so there's 18 episodes in the book, and each of them has a correspondence with something that happens or some element in the Odyssey. So, you know, the main characters of the book, Bloom is obviously Odysseus. He is the wanderer who eventually comes home in the end. Stephen Daedalus is Telemachus, Odysseus's son, who so the first 3 chapters of Ulysses are all about Stephen. We don't even meet Bloom until chapter 4. And then Molly Bloom is Penelope, the woman who is thwarting the suitors by weaving and unweaving this tapestry. Although this is an example of where it's not an exact thing, because Joyce is actually reversing certain elements, because Penelope is not faithful in this iteration of Ulysses. And she's also not just Penelope either. She is actually also Calypso, who is the one who, the sorceress who Odysseus is under the sway of and entrapped by in the beginning of the Odyssey.
Right. Yeah, he's kind of remarkably faithful in a Joycean way to, it's not like what is, there's also Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is another thing that stands out in my mind, as something that was not just sort of borrowing elements, but was like, we're gonna actually structure this thing like fairly strictly to the Odyssey.
Well, and the Coens are clearly influenced by Joyce. I think that's
yeah, I think that's probably
well,
true,
but who
yeah.
not right? On some level.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. Well, in talking about this, like, is he shrinking it down? Is he doing what? I think part of it, you know, we've got to take into account what Joyce's vision of reality was. You know, you've got this guy who's an apostate from the Catholic Church, who, you know, but weirdly thought that the Pope wasn't Christian enough. Was when part of Joyce's thing, I think, from reading the Element anyway, was when he began to understand the metaphorical quality of Christianity, then he could accept it. But he had to see it as a work of art that sort of pierced through the levels of reality, rather than like a story that strictly happened in this way. And I think he kind of saw everything that way. I think I was trying to find this passage in the Element. I don't know if I took a note of it, where it describes Joyce is his idea that an artist was the person who could see the patterns of reality itself. And he thought that there was only a limited number of things that could happen. And so I think partially like taking the Odyssey and putting it in the one day of like a common Irishman is his, one thing he's doing is he's saying like a little bit of as above, so below, right? Like
absolutely.
This is the pattern of reality, and you can see it everywhere.
So one way that he does this in Ulysses, because the Odyssey is only one layer of correspondence, right? So right. It's a very prominent one, but you know, each chapter, and you can look up charts of this, and I don't know how important it is to do on a first reading, but you know, once you have, then you can kind of dive into some of the other levels. The episodes also have corresponding arts and sciences. Each chapter has a dominant color, an organ or part of the body, and so on. And it's really weird. Like, I think Joyce, like, there was a lot of occultism going on in Ireland at the time, with like the Celtic Twilight. And these like secret societies were part of the national revival and myths and the exploration of all this stuff. And Joyce kind of like took a little bit of a dim view of that, and he sort of parodies these guys in the Scylla and Charybdis chapter. But that being said, the way Ulysses is put together really is reminiscent of something like tarot, which, Brad, I know you'd probably have a lot to say about that because it's built out of a body of correspondences.
It certainly, it seems to be that way, and he's structured it. He's structured it at all of these different levels, like you've said, to sort of. I wonder how much. Well, I kind of know. I think he understood that most people who picked up the book were not going to pick up on maybe any of this. They would see the Odyssey section. Some of it might be sort of implicitly kind of felt, but you're not able to really articulate it. I think he was writing in, I don't want to say he was writing in code, because that suggests there's like some secret message in there, but I think he was intentionally setting up a little bit of a labyrinth if you were willing to follow him down into it, if that makes sense. I mean, he said something about like, well, why did you write it so complicated? So I give the critics something to do for 300 years.
I packed it full of puzzles and enigmas and so on.
Which is fascinating and suggests a certain kind of mind. I did find this bit about Joyce's version of reality that I think is interesting, and it plays into Ulysses. This is from the Ellman biography. Joyce's fictional method does not presume that the artist has any supernatural power, but that he has an insight into the methods and motivations of the universe. Samuel Beckett has remarked that to Joyce, reality was a paradigm, an illustration of a possibly unstatable rule. Yet perhaps the rule can be surmised. It is not a perception of order or of love. More humble than either of these, it is the perception of coincidence. According to this rule, reality, no matter how much we may try to manipulate it, can only assume certain forms. The roulette wheel brings up the same numbers again and again. Everyone and everything shift about in a continual movement, yet movement limited in its possibilities. And this whole sense of coincidences became, and I think this is where the appeal of the occult stuff would be for him, even if he thought it was a little bit theatrical or didn't totally buy into it. I think this is where the appeal would be. He would become very superstitious over time. Like, I think there's something he said, I believe in all of the superstitions. So, and I think he thought that a superstition was somewhere where you'd kind of scratched the surface of reality to understand the pattern that went through everything, or something like that. He had weird things that he was, not weird, but he was terrified of lightning and thunder. He was terrified of dogs. He was fascinated with dates of things, like anybody who was born on his birthday, that was a big deal. Or any kinds of correspondences like that. He was constantly seeing them, to the point of almost like making them up. You know what I mean? Like, if you look hard enough, you can find coincidence anywhere you look. But he was definitely that sort of guy.
Yeah, and so Ulysses is set on this particular date that seemed to have like a mystical significance to him, June 16th, 1904. Mm-hmm. It's like it was the first date with Nora. I think you did mention that, right?
Yeah.
And it's reminiscent of Dante. Dante did that too. When he met Beatrice, that was fateful for his whole literary career. And not even met Beatrice. I think it was just that he saw her, and he associated her with the number 9, and that like wound up structuring all of the Divine Comedy. Yeah.
Well, and Joyce certainly was. Dante was on his Mount Rushmore, among a few other people. Ibsen, D'Annunzio, and I'm trying to think of the other writer that he had some other folks that he quite liked, but Joyce made the grand claim that Ibsen was better than Shakespeare. Which, wow. I don't know if anybody agrees with that.
That might be a little bit of Irish bias. There might be a little bit of a jab there. Yeah, people really admire Ibsen, though.
Oh yeah, no, and that's no downplay of Ibsen, but to be somebody that said no, I think Ibsen's better is pretty.
Again, the edgelord. He's the guy. He's like the Beatles. They're overrated.
Yeah, or it's anxiety of influence. I mean, there's a lot of Shakespeare in Ulysses. a lot of Shakespeare. Like there's almost as much Shakespeare reference as there is Homer reference. So
right. Yeah, I don't think he could escape it. Well, and then also Ulysses would be, well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So I want to get us back a little bit biographical, just so I can keep track of things in my own brain. So the question might arise is like, okay, so you've got this book, you've written a couple of things. James Joyce has written a couple of things that didn't really get any traction. He kind of can't get them printed or whatever, and then he becomes ultimately like this enormously influential writer. How does this happen, right? How do you get from one to the next? And the fact of the matter is, it's all about Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, who people may know is, he was, I guess he's a well-known modernist writer, but he's really even more than a writer. He's a sort of he reminds me of somebody who like organized everything at like in a school. He would find people and they would become pet projects. T.S. Eliot was one of them and James Joyce was another, but there were additional people beyond that. And he would sort of push them on everybody. So Ezra Pound, he was
future Art of Darkness subject, perhaps.
Oh yeah, we would definitely want to do Ezra Pound. Plus, he kind of lost his mind a little bit in the end, and he was an interesting guy, and a real talent too. I don't mean to dismiss him as his talent, but I think
we're going to Pound Town.
Yeah, we're going to. Yeah, we'll
at some point, probably next year. We have so many good episodes lined up for 2022.
Yeah,
it's going to be dynamite. We're going to play all the hits. Yeah.
So Ezra Pound had heard about Joyce through Yeats, and Yeats again, like always helping Joyce out. I think just because he was another Irishman, and he did really think he was talented. Pound reaches out to Joyce. Joyce, delighted to be finally recognized and thought of, excitedly starts sending him stuff. He sends him stories of Dubliners, which still hasn't been published at this time, and finishes up Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man and sends those off to Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound is as enthusiastic as he'd hoped he'd be, and starts to get the wheels turning on publishing some of this stuff in literary magazines in America. And this wheel starts to kind of turn in 1912. So now you're getting, very shortly after, you're going to get Dubliner short stories published in America. You're going to get parts of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man published in America. And then Joyce is going to get the sort of the recognition maybe he feels he needs to really get going on Ulysses. Now we'll get to, there were some sort of legal difficulties in publishing a bunch of his stuff, but I think we're going to end up talking about the Ulysses one because I think that's the most interesting from a legal standpoint. There's a good story about a trial in Greenwich Village in New York City with a bunch of Greenwich villagers there anxiously waiting to see if Ulysses is going to be allowed to publish. So we're going to talk about that. But I think it's important, talking about a modernist writer, there is one event that you can't leave out of the life of any modernist writer, and that's World War I. Joyce, again, is in Trieste, Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's full of Italians. Obviously, even if you don't know anything about World War I history, it's like something weird, something's going to be going on around those parts, right? Joyce ends up having to leave Trieste during World War I. He started to write Ulysses. His family's basically no longer safe there. Sadly, Stanislaw, who still lives there, his younger brother, lives there and is paying all his debts and all of this. Stanislaw had come out as very ardent and vocal in support of the Italians. And so he gets thrown in prison for the duration of World War I. Yeah, James is sort
of Central European prison at the turn of the century, roughly. Yeah, great.
Yeah. And James just is sort of like, well, we got to Zurich, so good luck, man.
So wait, he's in an Italian prison like in 1910, 1912, whatever?
1914, I guess it would actually be. Yeah. So, wow. So not good. And he's there for the duration of the war.
For supporting the Italians.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah, I didn't get a ton of detail about that, but and I don't know exactly what the conflict was, but Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of the.
And James is like, I'm out.
Right. Yep. I'm out. I'm going to Zurich. See you later, man. Thanks for taking care of literally everything.
Oof.
So he finds his way. So the Joyces find their way to Zurich, and it's interesting. It's funny. As soon as Stanislaw is locked up, stuff starts happening for James that he doesn't need the money anymore. He gets through the efforts of Yeats, he gets some money from the Royal Literary Fund or something like that from his home country, basically. He also ends up starting to get some patronage from people. People are just sending him money on a regular basis because of they support the work that has started to trickle out from Portrait and from Dubliners. He finds himself in this position in Zurich where he's like, it's all kind of starting to happen. Go ahead.
What has been published at this point?
Multiple parts of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, and multiple stories from Dubliners. And okay. I think when he'd hit Zurich, I don't remember exactly the timeline, but either in Zurich or shortly after moving, either before he got to Zurich or shortly after getting there, they published a section of Ulysses. So this is the thing, is the idea is like, man, he had these great expanses between publishing these books. The fact is he's publishing sections of them all throughout. It's serialized, not quite in the sense of like it came out every week, like a Charles Dickens thing, but like, by the time Ulysses hit the shelves in a full bound copy, a lot of the most interested parties had read a great deal of it already.
So he's the hot young thing of Irish letters. He's up and coming enough so that people want to chuck him a buck to support him.
It's right. It's starting to happen, right? And
all right.
One of his big supporters is Harriet Shaw Weaver, who ran a magazine called The Egoist and was sort of independently wealthy as well. She had published most of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, was ultimately going to try and publish the entire thing as a book, even though they weren't really set up as a book publisher. That was a little bit difficult. They ended up having to pass it over to another publisher. But interestingly, 1916, both Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man and Dubliners get their first full volume publication in the same month. So he's been working for, years and years and years, and just little here and there victories. And finally, 2 books come out in the same month, which I think
bam.
Yeah, which I think Joyce would also appreciate the coincidence of.
Sure. Yeah. That's often how it happens, though. You toil in obscurity and then suddenly,
Yeah. What happens if you keep toiling in obscurity?
If you keep toiling in obscurity, eventually, occasionally, something will happen. Possibly, okay. Maybe. Right. Yeah. Don't give up. Don't give up out there in podcast land. We're all going to make it.
Now, the cool thing about Zurich, and I didn't know this, but it totally makes sense. During Zurich in World War I, Zurich is in Switzerland, everybody knows that, but Switzerland is essentially neutral territory. So all the eccentrics, I don't want to say all, many of the eccentrics and bohemians and artists of that era found their way to Zurich. So suddenly, overnight, Zurich is like the European capital of culture and art for a while. And Joyce is like right there in the thick of it. He's making friends left and right. He goes to this cafe all the time that Lenin also went to all the time. And apparently it's not fully documented, but it's believed that they met at least once there.
I am the walrus.
Right. Yeah.
Not John Lennon. Yeah. Okay. All right. We're not going to go into I have been to Zurich. Zurich is a beautiful, beautiful. Switzerland is a beautiful country. Zurich is a beautiful town. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Dada comes out of there, right?
I think so. Yeah.
That could be.
And then I think Hermann Hesse as well.
Yeah. And the thing is, Joyce, you have to think Joyce was probably pretty cool. Like, he wasn't cool probably to be married to, or to be the brother of, who's like, you're paying all of his debts. But I think if he was a dude that you met in the bar, he must have been a lot of fun. He loved to sing. He chat. He was a chatterbox. He paid for a lot of people's drinks. I mean, that was part of the reason Stanislaw had to cover his debts a lot of the times. He did this thing. He would frequently, his daughter-in-law, Helen, would say that when he drank, liquor didn't go to his head, it went to his feet. He would do this thing that his friends described as the spider dance, which unfortunately has not survived into a YouTube video, but I have to imagine is some kind of like flailing, like, he's a tall, skinny guy. And I just imagine him getting very like, dancing insanely.
Dance. Yeah. I choose to think of James Joyce dancing like Elaine in Seinfeld.
Yeah.
That is the choice that I'm making right now.
Okay. So Zurich actually serves him pretty well, and he stays there for quite a long time. Another thing, he starts to meet some people who are disciples of either Freud or Jung. And again, he didn't believe in this quote unquote psychoanalyst nonsense. In fact, one of his patrons, who was just sending him money every month, told him that he had to keep getting the stipend, he had to go to Jung for psychoanalysis. And he said, I'm not doing that. That's not happening.
That stuff has always been a cult. Yeah. It's a cult. It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, big time. Or cult adjacent. I don't doubt
sure.
that it's helped a lot of people, but there is a cultic quality to it. And we're going to do both of those guys.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to do Freud.
There's a fun...
Jung.
There's a fun little dig at those guys in Finnegan's Wake. 'Cause he says... they were young and easily Freudened as a pun that he makes in Finnegan's Wake that I like.
That's brilliant. Yeah. It's there. Yeah, we'll get to talking about them now. One thing I do want to maybe put as a little teaser out there that we're going to draw ourselves to, because this is towards the end of the Joyce story. Joyce's daughter is treated by Carl Jung a few years, several years down the road from this point that we're at now. So in Zurich, bits of Ulysses start to come out. Now they start getting published in America in American journals, but they actually get or sent over, and they get confiscated and destroyed. And there ends up over time being a trial about whether this work is obscene or not. And I want to read you a bit of it, because actually part of it's kind of funny, this whole trial thing. Joyce had all these people who were helping him. Not only Ezra Pound, but Harriet Weaver, but a number of other publishers and socialites and people who had become convinced of his brilliance. So it's not like Joyce went over to the United States to defend him. It was various publishers and things. So it's on trial in New York. It's a courtroom full of Greenwich Villagers and, artistic types and things like that, various editors and publishers and things like that. And I just think that this is funny. So this is from the Ellman biography describing the trial. It was now time to read the obscene passages, carefully culled by Sumner. One judge urged that they not be read in the presence of Miss Anderson. She's a lady. But she is the publisher, said John Quinn, who was defending the book. So the judge didn't want the book to be read in front of the woman who had published the book, because he didn't want to offend her sensibilities, right? When the passages were read, two of the judges found them incomprehensible. Quinn was glad to agree. Quinn is defending the book. Quinn was glad to agree, since if they could not be understood, they could not corrupt, but rather lamely attributed the difficulty to the lack of punctuation, which, lamely again, he attributed to the failure of Joyce's eyesight. It was decided to adjourn the trial for a week to give the judges time to read the whole Nausicaa episode. Okay, so moving down here a little bit. There is proof. There is my best exhibit. Oh, okay. This is Quinn defending it again. There is my best exhibit. There is proof that Ulysses does not corrupt or fill people full of lascivious thoughts. Look at him. He is mad all over. He wants to hit somebody. He doesn't want to love anybody. So part of the argument was the lawyer, the legal system was saying it's obscene, and the whole idea, if it's obscene, it's going to get people horned up, basically. You don't want to do that.
But they can't understand it, so how are they going to get all horned up?
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the other defenses was that, like, listen, it's not seductive, it's repulsive. Like, yes, there is, like, there's like a masturbation scene in there or whatever, but it's not sexy. It's it's gross, was kind of part of the tenor of their argument, right?
How much anti-Irish bias was involved in this?
That's a good question. Now, none of it comes up in the biography, but I think it was probably there. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So eventually the judge says, he says, okay, it's fine. It was understood the publication of Ulysses would be discontinued. Quinn had to certify that the Nautica episode was the worst in the book to save his clients from being sent to prison. So actually, this is an earlier trial where it didn't get fully, they actually did have to pay a fine or something. The judge said, and now for God's sakes, this is to Margaret Anderson, the woman he didn't want to read the story in front of. He says, and now for God's sake, don't publish any more obscene literature. And she said, how am I to know when it's obscene? The judge replied, I'm not sure. I'm sure I don't know, but don't do it. So they couldn't even understand what was obscene about it exactly, except that
I know it when I see it.
Obscene. Yeah, right. It was definitely
I know it when I see
of
it.
that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of thing that Joyce's publication was up against, and eventually he would win as social, as the social milieu changes over time. But yeah, this is the kind of funny thing that he's set himself up against.
Well, didn't some very heavy people came to his defense, though, right? This was
over time,
vanguard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Over time, it was like the entire artistic establishment was on his side, so it seemed kind of ridiculous to fight back against it. But it took time, and it does have things that go against the sensibilities of that time for sure. 1920. Now this is the war is over, so we're kind of skipping past the war a little bit. Joyce just hid out in Zurich, so it's not as big a deal for him as it was for a lot of other people. Though he did have people that he went to school with, for instance, who got caught up in it and died. And he certainly wasn't. He and his family, Nora and Giorgio and Lucia, they weren't affected by it, but they certainly knew people who were, and they'd been displaced, even though they got to a place that was pretty good for them. They moved back to Trieste for a while, though there's no money. He can't work at the school. It's the social dynamics have changed entirely, so he can't really figure out what to do. Stanislaus let out of prison, and their relationship is never the same because, Stanislaus is not just going to go back to paying him, forking money over to him. So in 1920, Joyce goes to meet Ezra Pound in Paris. He's going to stay for a week, and he ends up basically staying for more or less the next 20 years. Also, by this time, his legend has started to grow. I mean, he's been part of a court case in New York, right? And people are starting to be able to read his stuff. He becomes kind of a legend before Ulysses is even published. I want to read you this thing from the Elman, and then hopefully, I think we can get into talking about Finnegan's Wake a little bit. So this is Joyce writing to Weaver, who is his primary supporter. She was giving him, I can't remember what it was. It was some number of pounds per month as like a stipend. Dear Miss Weaver, a nice collection could be made of legends about me. Here are some. My family in Dublin believe that I have enriched myself in Switzerland during the war by espionage work for one or both combatants. Triestians, seeing me emerge from my relative's house occupied by my furniture for about 20 minutes every day and walk to the same points, the GPO and back, circulated the rumor, now firmly believed, that I am a cocaine victim. The general rumor in Dublin was, till the prospectus of Ulysses stopped it, that I could write no more, had broken down, and was dying in New York. A man from Liverpool told me he had heard that I was the owner of several cinema theaters all over Switzerland. He actually had tried to start a theater in Dublin. In America, there appear to be or have been two versions. One that I was an austere mixture of the Dalai Lama and Sir Rabindranath Tagore. Mr. Pound described me as a dour Aberdeen minister. Mr. Lewis told me he was told that I was a crazy fellow who always carried 4 watches and rarely spoke except to ask my neighbor what o'clock it was. Mr. Yates seemed to have described me to Mr. Pound as a kind of Dick Swiveler. I have no idea what that means. What the numerous and useless people to whom I have been introduced here think I don't know. My habit of addressing people I have just met for the first time as Monsieur and earned for me the reputation of a tout petit bourgeois, while others consider that I intend for politeness as while others consider what I intend for politeness as most offensive. One woman here originated the rumor that I am extremely lazy and will never finish anything. I calculate that I must have spent nearly 20,000 hours writing in Ulysses. A batch of people in Zurich persuaded themselves that I was gradually going mad and actually endeavored to induce me to enter a sanatorium where a certain Dr. Jung, the Swiss Tweedledum, who is not to be confused with the Viennese Tweedledee, Dr. Freud, amuses himself at the expense of ladies and gentlemen who are troubled with bees in their bonnets. So anyway, that's a kind of extended passage, but like Joyce is now like a thing in the world, right? There's people who know of him in America, but nobody really kind of knows what his deal is. Part of that is the time, you don't have the internet, you can't watch a YouTube video of him or whatever. But part of it is there is a little bit of a mystique to this guy, this Ulysses
some buzz. Book. What is this book about? Right. Yeah. Dick Swiveler is a fictional character in the 1841 novel The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Initially a comical accessory to the antagonists, he undergoes a transformation, but he's easily manipulated, a fool. He's a Dick Swiveler.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
I looked it up in the background.
Yeah, I appreciate you did that because I realized I read that and it was capitalized, and I was like, wait, that's got to be like a reference.
What a fun name.
Yeah. So let's do. I want to get into Finnegan's Wake, and I know we're going a lot of time, but this is Joyce, and it feels like we've got to. I want to read a couple of things that people said about Ulysses at the time, and these are mostly names that we know. Okay, as we said, Virginia Woolf said it was the queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples. T.S. Eliot said Joyce killed the 19th century, exposed the futility of styles, and destroyed his own future. Basically, when he wrote Ulysses, what else were you going to do? There was nothing left for him to write another book about. And yet, Bloom tells one nothing. Indeed, this new method of giving the psychology proves to my mind that it doesn't work. It doesn't tell as much as some casual glance from outside often tells. Gertrude Stein said, Joyce is good. He is a good writer. People like him because he is incomprehensible and anybody can understand him. I don't know what that means exactly. But who came first, Gertrude Stein or James Joy? He has had his day. Hemingway.
So many flaming egos in this arena. Oh, right? God. It does remind me of like the podcast wars or sort of like our little niche side of Twitter. You have the little battles that are so SSDD.
Yeah. Hemingway, he told us to Sherwood Anderson. Hemingway and Joyce would become friends in Paris, actually, and hang out.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, I think I knew that.
Joyce and Hemingway there was a couple instances apparently where like Joyce would get in Paris, would kind of get into trouble at the bar and would just with like some rough looking guys. And it would just be like, get him, Hem. You get him.
That sounds like a gruesome twosome if there ever was. James Joyce, Hemingway.
James Joyce spider dancing and just like speaking in like some weird Latin.
Yeah. Fun.
This is what Hemingway had to say. I think this was maybe before they actually met. Joyce has a most gosh darn wonderful book. That's not what he said exactly, but it will probably reach you in time. He's talking to Sherwood Anderson here. Meantime, the report is that he and all his family are starving, but you can find the whole Celtic crew of them every night in Mashawds, where Binny and I can only afford to go about once a week. Stein says Joyce reminds her of an old woman out in San Francisco. John Joyce, James Joyce's father, read some parts of the book and said, well, James is a nice sort of blackguard, isn't he? I don't even... Andre Gide called it a sham masterpiece. Yates said it is perhaps a work of genius. It is entirely a new thing, neither what the eye sees or the ear hears, but what the rambling mind thinks and imagines from moment to moment. he has certainly surpassed in intensity any novelist of our time. Also, Yeats could not finish reading it, which I think is really interesting, among a few other people who.
I am gonna have to give this another try. I'm going to have to do it after this episode. And I know that we are going to do something fun with this where I think we're going to dump this episode into the brain of Aaron Gwynn, who's friend of the show, did the Faulkner episode, and he's a scholar of Joyce. So I think we might have to hear from him and get his opinions about where we got it wrong and everything else. That should be fun too.
There's plenty to get right and wrong for sure.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So let's get into Finnegan's Wake, because now he's written Ulysses. Ulysses is actually does pretty well with Ulysses. Part of the way he got it published was through there was this woman named Sylvia Beach in Paris, who had a bookstore called Shakespeare and Company, and she had decided for the first time to publish a book. Then there were some complications with the American version and all of that, but there was actually quite a bit of enthusiasm. And if you were smart and hip and literary, you tried to get your hands on a copy of Ulysses in this early to mid 1920s era. Like I said, all these people read it. Everybody else who was into that world read it. I think it was probably a little bit in terms of like where it sat in the culture. It was probably a little bit like Infinite Jest-ish, where like it had its certain appeal and its kind of sexiness and like, and Joyce managed to get himself a really sweet royalty deal. So he actually made reasonably good money selling Ulysses, which I think it goes against what I had always thought. I had thought that he put this thing out and then nobody read it for 20 years. And then it finally like kind of bubbled to the surface, but that is not actually the case. Because of copyright issues, though, it was pirated in America for years. And also in Japan for years. So that's just kind of interesting. And he would try and hire lawyers to sue people that he, couldn't find and things like that. It was kind of interesting. But the next thing he started to work on was Finnegan's Wake. So he'd been working on Ulysses for years, and he kind of flips the page and starts to work on Finnegan's Wake. So Aldous, what can anybody tell us anything about Finnegan's Wake? And if so, can you?
I think I can tell you a little bit, but what I want to do, I feel like such an idiot because earlier I said that I had not directly dealt with Joyce on my podcast. I did an episode on Finnegan's Wake. It was one of the earlier ones.
Yes, you did. I listened back to that a little bit, actually. When you said that, I was like, wait, okay, well, all right.
No, but yeah, I didn't really, there was not a lot of analysis in there. I did read a bunch from it. And so what I'd like to do is just introduce it by just reading some, so you get a sense of what this is like.
Yeah, please do.
So I'm going to read the first page of Finnegan's Wake and probably stumble over it horribly, but let's go anyway. Okay, here we go. River run past even Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. Sir Tristram Villor de Moris, for the short sea, had Passancourt re-arrived from North Armorica on this side the scraggy isthmus of Europe Minor to wield or fight his peninsulate war, nor had top Sawyer's rocks by the stream Oconee exaggerated themselves to Lawrence County Gorgios, while they went Dublin their mumper all the time. Nor a voice from afire bellowsed Misha Misha to Tauf Tauf, Towert Petrick, not yet, though Venesoon after had a kidscad butt ended a bland old Isaac, not yet, though all's fair in Vanity, were Sosie Sesters Roth and with Twone Nathan Joe, wrought a peck of paws malt had gem or shen brewed by Arclight and Rorient the Regenbrow, was to be seen ringsome on the aqua face. The fall, Baba ba dal garag taka minaronkon bron ton ron thuan thun trovar haun sound scon tu hu hurden thurnuk of a once wall-straight old par is retailed early in bed and later on life, down through all Christian minstrelsy. The great fall of the off-wall entailed at such short notice the shoot of Finnegan, erst solid man, that the Humpty Hill head of himself promptly sends an unquiring one well to the west in quest of his tumty-tum toes, and their upturned pike-pointed place is at the knock out in the park, where oranges have been laid to rust upon the green since Devlin's first love, Livy.
Oh yeah, that's clear. That's
yeah.
Okay,
did you guys get anything out of that?
It's a little bit of a psychedelic experience. Like I feel like I can't extract much like tractable content from it, but it feels a certain way, I would say.
You could spend hours and hours and hours researching what you just read, trying to figure out what is rhyming slang.
Right.
Cockney rhyming slang in London as a whole thing, right? I'm sure that's in play. I'm sure you would need to know Irish slang, Irish, probably Greek, Latin, other languages. It's a puzzle.
It really is.
It is a puzzle, although there's a certain musicality to it. And it's funny, you mentioned psychedelic. Like, I think it, the first generation of, I don't know, generation is right, but the first group of people to read this were a lot of people who had supported Joyce through Ulysses, and they were very dug into the modernist aesthetic, and a lot of them couldn't go this far with him and didn't, including Pound.
Right.
Pound was not a fan of this, but in the 60s and 70s, you started getting a group of people who did identify this book as like a psychedelic book, and they were kind of more into it. People like Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna. One of the earlier ones, probably Marshall McLuhan, actually, and a lot of his work actually derives from McLuhan's really kind of obsessive interest in this book. So anyway, there are somewhere between 60 and 70 languages actually that feed into Finnegan's Wake.
Right.
It is English, but it's part of it feels like going back and reading like something from early Middle English or something like that. Maybe Canterbury Tales, where like you can read it, but some of it would need to be translated for you because of there's still that strong influence of Norman French or something.
Right. Yeah, you imagine that what the translation effort would be on fit. Like, let's say you were going to translate it into Spanish. Like, what do you even?
How could it even be done?
Yeah, it's incredible.
It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it seems like you would just leave it alone. But so maybe we kind of, now there's this idea that, well, Joyce said this, he said many things about Finnegan's Wake. One is that Ulysses was his day book and this was his night book. And I think partially what he was suggesting by that, not even just suggesting, but also said in some of his letters, is that he's trying to take that stream of consciousness thing and move it into the realm of the dream, outside of the waking conscious and into the dream, but essentially the same, not the same technique, but the same approach, I guess.
It's a stream of unconscious. That's the thing I was thinking about earlier.
Yeah. No, that's really well put. So it's like, so he's doing that, but I think what is harder to see unless maybe you read, and I have a copy of Finnegan's Wake and I've had it for years. And I remember this was a long time ago. I was probably 19 years old or something. And a guy that I worked with had told me that he knew about or had read about some group of people that got together and they would smoke cannabis that had been tainted with formaldehyde, and they would read one page of Finnegan's Wake out loud to each other. That was like this like cultic thing they were doing. And so I was like, this was like before I had this is before college or anything. So I was like, wait, what is this book? like, and found myself a copy. And then for years afterwards, I never really sat down to try to read it, but I would read. I would skip the formaldehyde, but I would read. I would read. I don't know where that
Formaldehyde.
I do. This is what this kid told me. He might have been totally making it up. But I would, for years, I would just flip to a random page and read it and see like if it did anything for me, you know. And I'm interested in that process too. Like, can it just work as a page at random?
There is a totemic quality to that book as an object.
Yeah.
This is a copy of Finnegan's Wake. It's not quite like any other book.
No,
Yeah.
It's really not.
I think it can work that way. I think there's not one way to look at it. It's not really. It's such a departure from the traditional novel, and I think that I think in part it is meant to be read aloud. Mm-hmm. And maybe often in a group. That's how I used to do this on St. Patrick's Day. Oh, cool. And I would get a bunch of people who were drinking hard, and I would read this book with them. I didn't even know what was going on. Sometimes I would, you just pass the book to the next person and they read as long as they can tolerate it. And then you keep going. So, that's cool. Yeah, I can get into a little bit about what, we think the book is about.
Yeah. That's what I want to try to understand it a little bit more, what the thing's about.
Yeah. So the dream thing is right on. It is supposed to be the story of a single night's worth of dreaming in Dublin, Ireland. We are still in Dublin, and like technically Joyce's books are all in the same universe. Like, characters from Dubliners crop up in Ulysses, and I think they're even mentioned here and there in Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, really? Okay.
It is perhaps the dream of one man, or maybe the dream of different people, or one man who is everyone. The dream contains human history in a vast cycle, which is somewhat based on the ideas of a early 18th century thinker named Giambattista Vico, who wrote a book called The New Science. And he had a cyclical theory of history where we pass through an age of gods, an age of heroes, and an age of men. And so that's theocracy, aristocracy, democracy. And then what he called a recurso, which is a return of barbarism in the end of the cycle. And so if you go back to, Vico's cycle serves kind of the same function as Homer's Odyssey does in Ulysses. And if you go back to the beginning, the first sentence, it begins, river run past even Adams from swerve of shore to bend to bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. So we begin by returning, and he name checks Vico there and tells us a little bit of what's going on. And so from this, people, they determine, when you get to the end of the book, the last word in this book is the. Right? So you come to the end of Finnegan's Wake, it just cuts off.
Right.
And then you realize that
it's
a circle.
Yeah.
Technically, this is the longest book ever written by far because it's infinite.
It's infinite. Right. That's fascinating. And he'd said something. Apparently, he had taken him a while to come to using the word. I think he always knew, or he knew from early on, that he wanted to write it as a cycle, but it took him a long time. So Ulysses ends with the word yes. And he was very cognizant of how you ended the actual final word. And apparently he actually wanted to find the weakest word in the English language to end on. And he sort of gradually arrived at, the, because he saw it as almost not even a word. It's just like a,
because it can't stand by itself.
It can't, right. It doesn't mean anything by itself. Yeah. It's very interesting that he chose that.
So, you can break down the title too. So why is it called Finnegan's Wake? Well, there's a folk song called Finnegan's Wake, and I recommend going to listen to it because it's a really cool, like, Irish drinking song. But the story that's told in the song, it's about a bricklayer named Tim Finnegan who gets too drunk at work. It's speaking of dealing in Irish stereotypes. Nobody deals with them better than the Irish themselves. But so Tim, a bit of a tippling way, and he falls off a ladder and breaks his skull. And then his friends lay out his body for an Irish wake, and like happens, a fight breaks out, and they spill liquor all over Tim's body, and he wakes up and he's like, "What, did you think I was dead?" So, there's already a pun actually like in the song because he woke up at his wake.
Yeah.
And so what Joyce does is in the beginning of this book is he combines Tim Finnegan in the song with the mythical Irish giant Finn McCool, this hunter heroic character. And Finn was supposed to have built the Giant's Causeway, which is a geometric stone formation in Ireland. And so this mythical Finn is also a bricklayer. And another myth about Finn McCool is that he was said to have not died, but to be asleep in a cave somewhere and will arise one day when Ireland needs him. All right. So we have
Wake. Yeah.
Yeah, we have the wake as well. And so, the sleeping and waking in the book is the dream, the falling asleep, dreaming, waking up, and that's that cycle. It's even better than this, though, because the cycle is embedded in the name Finnegan. Finn means ending, it means end, and then after Finn is again.
Yeah.
There you go. The book exists in miniature in one word.
Yeah, it's a fractal. Yeah. That's so cool. He apparently, for years, he would call, when he was working on it, he called it the work in progress. And he was always trying to goad his friends into guessing what the title was. He was so pleased with it that he would, like, when he would get drunk, he would, at one point, he put up like some amount of money and offered to give it to anybody who could guess. He was very much like, it was a game to him.
The literary Riddler, James Joyce.
Yeah, right. That's right, for sure. Yeah.
And another thing to note is that the title has no apostrophe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it can be read in the imperative form. Finnegan's wake.
Right. Yeah. Finnegan's being like the sort of Irish, as a Irish Smith kind of name, right? It's like
Irish spirit.
Yeah.
Finnegan. I had not thought about that.
Yeah.
I love that kind of wordplay and puns and meaning within meaning. But again, I don't think I'm going to pick this up and read
just read a page.
Yeah. I should get a copy and just have it set it next to the commode.
Right. Right. That's probably a good way to read it. Every time you go in, just read a couple pages.
So one more thing just about the section that we read. You probably noticed an extremely long and weird word that I kind of awkwardly went through.
You did better than I would have. Yeah.
After I said the fall. So this is what is called a thunder word. And you mentioned that Joyce was afraid of lightning. Mm-hmm. And so again, like he's layering in his own experience here. Like this is him at his most mythic, but at the same time, it's very personal. And there's a thing in Vico where Vico has this really weird idea that Noah's sons had apostatized and began wandering the earth, and their children became giants. And that civilized life, like shrunk people down to normal size, and living in this like brutal like existence that was unstructured, like gave people a larger stature. Which, by the way, I'm so fascinated with this idea. I've decided I'm going to do a Forest of Symbols on giants one day.
Oh yeah, I like that.
But the beginning of civilization happens when they become afraid of the thunder and lightning, and they interpret this as God, the voice of God, right? And they run off to caves, somewhere. And so Joyce comes up with this thing called a thunder word, which happens 10 times throughout Finnegan's Wake, and it's Vico's, voice of God. And so what he's done is he has the whole thing is just a bunch of words for thunder in a bunch of different languages. Each thunder word is 100 letters, except for the 10th one, I think, which is 101 letters, totaling 1001, as in 1001 nights, right? So again, just endless, semantic layering and multi many meanings packed in there.
Yeah, that's never
thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he had a phobia of these, didn't he?
He did, yeah. There were
She
times
said,
where he wouldn't go from one place to another because it was storming, or yeah. And you kind of wonder, as an apostate from the Catholic Church who still kind of believes in some way, and who's also believes all the superstitions of Europe, whether he thought it was like, well, this might be the time that God smites me, like from my sinful nature,
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was gonna read, I had a little thing about Joyce explaining to somebody, and this just kind of reflects the depth of thought about each little part of this book, Finnegan's Wake. So I'm gonna just read this part from the Ellman biography, and this is just a example of how he's thinking about the smallest details, and Joyce saying it, kind of in Joyce's actual life. So this is while he's working on Finnegan's Wake. During the early summer, he had help from James Johnson Sweeney, the museum director and art critic, who read the manuscript aloud and inserted phrases which Joyce dictated to him. His eyes were getting quite bad as Finnegan's Wake went on. They came to a passage, and this is from Finnegan's Wake. Clontarf, one love, one fear. And Joyce asked, "Do you understand that, Sweeney?" "Oh, yes," Sweeney said. "The last two numbers of the date of the Battle of Clontarf." Joyce seemed to agree. Later, Sweeney realized that one love would in tennis represent the first two numbers of the date, and the next afternoon he said, "Mr. Joyce, I pretended to understand more of that Clontarf reference than I did. Joyce replied, "Oh, yes, the telephone number of that public house." And Sweeney realized that he had still only understood part of the phrase, that Joyce was referring also to Clontarf as the telephone exchange in Chapelizod. They came to the catchphrase, "Knock, knock, who's there?" Joyce had altered it to, "Knock, knock, war's where?" and given for answer the two twins, with two W's and two N's in the twins. He explained to Sweeney that Cain and Abel were the origin of war. The second W in twins, Joyce said, laughing, was for Eve, and meant, as the next phrase indicated, without an apple, for she had been born without an Adam's apple. So every sentence of this thing is just you can zoom in and zoom out on it. It's a fractal almost in its level of detail
exactly.
and referencing, right? And so I just wanted to give. It's certainly not the most referenced or most profound sentence from Finnegan's Wake, but it's an example of how deep it actually can be. So it's wordplay, it's historical reference, it's biblical reference, it's everything. Yeah, it's fascinating, really.
How long? I'm exhausted hearing about this. I really am. I love this stuff. I can admit that I admire it, and that Aldous, that interpretation is more insight into this novel than I've ever been on the receiving end of. Yeah. So I'm very grateful of that, and I appreciate that it invites you to look at the book in a different way, to look at language in a different way, and to think about different ways of reading and understanding. And then also is just this incredible monumental challenge. It's the Kilimanjaro, it's the K2 of books. Right. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he worked on this thing for ultimately 17 years. He worked on Finnegan's Wake. We can certainly continue talking about it. I want to give a little bit of historical context of those 17 years because it starts in Paris. And he's got some notoriety and some fame, and he's meeting a lot of people in Paris. I mean, he met Stravinsky and he met Marcel Proust, and he met kind of everybody. Like I said, Hemingway and things, and really kind of got himself ensconced in the art world. And yet a lot of things as Finnegan's Wake developed, his life was sort of falling apart in many ways. So this happens on a couple of levels. So one is, and we have to talk about Lucia. Lucia was his daughter. Lucia lost her mind pretty much completely. So let me find this section where I kind of have a little bit on her, and I want to get her the dates of a couple things that happened. I want to get them right. 1932. It's literally on Joyce's 50th birthday, right? And things have been getting worse in this regard. His health had been getting worse. He'd been having eye surgeries. Like I said, he probably had syphilis that made his eyes worse. He was starting to have some stomach troubles as well. Interestingly, there were some treatments that they did for his eyes, and like early on they were putting leeches on his eyes. So this is still the era of medicine that we're in. Yeah, to get the blood out, right? So he could see, so it would reduce the inflammation.
Oh no. I'm having a reaction to this. I don't like this at all. Brad, trust the science.
Right. Just put a leech on it. I mean, it worked for Joyce, except it didn't. But they're also injecting him with a combination of arsenic and something else. Which this is how researchers now believe he had syphilis, because you never apparently used this concoction for anything but to treat syphilis. He would also occasionally get treated with scopolamine. And for folks who don't know what scopolamine is, scopolamine used to be used, it's derived from nightshade, and it used to be used in combination with morphine to put you into twilight sleep. But it's a known deliriant. There are reports of people using it recreationally, though I don't see how that would be pleasant. It's a drug that has been used. It's used now for nausea in very, very, very tiny doses. Like if you take a pill or take a patch for seasickness, I think it'll have like some fractional percent scopolamine. So he was getting treated with that.
Wasn't that an interrogation drug too? That was like the truth serum.
Yeah, there was some stories about in South America not that long ago of people dosing other people with scopolamine because it makes you highly impressionable. And so it would be like you would dose somebody with scopolamine, and then you would say, "Why don't you give me all of your money?" And they would. Like, so he's writing Finnegan's Wake, and it's this deeply referenced thing, but he's also in a lot of pain. And then who knows what effect congenital syphilis is having on him, periods of blindness are having on him, the treatments for periods of blindness are having on him, right? Things are a little bit unraveling, even though he's able to concentrate enough to put this book together. Now, and then also we have Lucia. Joyce's 50th birthday, Lucia, who's been becoming increasingly agitated. This is 1932, so she's 25 or so. 25. She throws a chair at Nora. Nora was always the target of Lucia's ire. She throws a chair at her, and Giorgio, decides to put her in a sanitarium. She's only there for a couple of days before James pulls her out. But this is just the beginning of this like downward slide for Lucia. Lucia fell for Samuel Beckett, who was a translator and sort of friend and assistant and confidant of James Joyce. And for people who don't know, he wrote Waiting for Godot and a number of other, timeless works. We'll have to do a Beckett episode eventually as well. So Lucia fell for Samuel Beckett. They apparently had a very brief relationship before Samuel Beckett told her, like, "Hey, the reason that I come over is to see your dad, right?" Like, was that kind of dumped her, I guess, which didn't help things. They tried to marry Lucia off. They thought that this might help her maintain her sanity. And that didn't go particularly well. And she just kind of gradually started getting worse and worse and worse. She had sort of delusions of grandeur at one moment, was super depressed at another moment. Eventually she would like to set things on fire. And she would have very violent outbursts, particularly directed at Nora. She had an odd, I don't know how to put it. There's a relationship she had with James that is, you might call it incestuous, though I don't think there was any physical relationship there. She was kind of obsessed with him to a certain extent. But the doctors believed that they almost had like a folie à deux thing going where they were kind of crazy together. And James believed that Lucia was like the only person that really understood what he was doing. The way he used to think Nora was the only person who understood what he was doing.
So he flipped the script there and kind of put it on her.
Right. And he would think like she has the same thing wrong with her as I do, except it's burning her alive. Whereas I can manage it somehow. That was kind of and he claimed that she was clairvoyant, that there were hundreds of times where she had done something that was like psychic, essentially. And, you know, when he didn't think she was crazy, James, that is, he would think that she was just a confused and stressed out girl and that he could help her by doing things like buying her a fur coat or, you know, just being nice to her, when you were clearly dealing with somebody who had schizophrenia, right? You know, there are a lot of stories from this era of women who were institutionalized because they were quote unquote hysterical, where they were really just like sort of strong-minded. Maybe
they were like riotously funny at parties, so
right? And yeah, you put them in a home.
Right.
At first, I thought maybe that's what we were dealing with Lucia, and now it's pretty clear that she had some serious mental issues. Yeah. And this story kind of never gets better, unfortunately. Eventually, she, this is kind of years later, eventually she does get treated by Jung. And let's see, I think I had a thing here about that. Oh, so she was willing to talk with Carl Jung for a while. And it seemed like they maybe even had a good rapport. She started to gain some weight and be a little bit more amiable. But then it kind of just went away, you know, as her condition worsened. And apparently Jung wasn't quite up to the task. And that suggests to me that at least at that time, maybe nobody was up to the task. And she said, she was kind of a wit too. At one point she said about Jung, to think that such a big, fat, materialistic Swiss man should try to get hold of my soul. She was indignant that this guy would try and fix her, right?
Oof. Yeah, Jung is not coming out looking good.
No, not in this episode. Not in this episode, unfortunately.
We'll circle back to him.
Yeah. So now here's one thing. So with Lucia, you know, I don't want to go on. We could do an episode about her. She did some dancing, and then gave up on it. Apparently she moved into doing ballet too late. Most ballerinas start when they're like 8 years old, and she'd started too late to develop the toe strength and all of that. So that didn't work, but she was quite a talented illustrator. And one thing that Joyce did to try and help her like mentally was he paid a publisher to pay her to illustrate the first letters in like an ABC book for children. And apparently that was quite good, kind of Book of Kells inspired. So she wasn't a woman without talent. But Jung said this about her and her father, her and James. Lucia and her father are like two people going to the bottom of the river, one falling and the other diving. So he thought they basically were kind of the same person, except that James somehow, it was the same conclusion that James had, except James was somehow able to swim in this, and Lucia could not. She couldn't handle it, right? That's what both takes were on this whole thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this is all kind of happening. It keeps devolving. Finally, in 1936, she's taken to an asylum in Paris in a straitjacket. And she's basically in an institution until her death in 1982.
82?
Yeah, she lived to be 75 years old and was basically in a home of one sort or another, you know, from throughout.
That must have caused him incredible distress.
Oh, yeah. No, he blamed himself a lot. I think part of the reason that he was unwilling to admit that she had a problem, at least early on, was because he blamed himself for raising her in this like intransigent lifestyle, right?
Yeah,
like,
no doubt.
You know, we moved all over.
You ripped your family out of Ireland, this thing that you wrestle with in your letters, in your writing, your entire life, raised them in Central Europe,
Yeah.
in Italy, then in Paris.
Yeah.
And they're not rooted in the same reality that you were rooted in. And then, of course, she falls away from reality.
Right.
There's something poetic about that.
Yeah. So he kind of blamed himself, and maybe there is some share of the blame, but I think,
might have also just straight up schizophrenic.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those things that there's certain strains of this where unfortunately you kind of just can't fit into society anymore.
Just some things the leeches just don't fix.
Right. And there's a whole caper during the beginnings of World War II, which is kind of crazy, where Joyce is trying to get her out of one institution and into, because she's in Paris in an institution when Paris gets taken over. And he's like trying to get her out and get her into an institution on the west side of France. That's this whole thing. Yeah,
I got a flag that we are well into the third hour of the James Joyce episode. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, we're getting there. Yeah,
I think we are. Yes, and hopefully you're enjoying the episode. I'm personally very excited for the raunchy love letters that are to come on the Patreon episode, artofdarkpod.com/ support has all of the stuff. I'm going to say it one more time, artofdarkpod.com/support. You can send us Bitcoin. You can send us, although maybe I'm looking at the chart right now, maybe don't send Bitcoin. Wait for it to pump.
If they're turning it into dollars, we want them to do it when it's
whatever you feel. The show is worth. We just are kicking out 3 hours of free content for you. So if you want to support the show, please do that. And I want to thank Aldous as well. That take on Finnegan's Wake was tremendous. Where else are you going to get stuff like this? I'm really enjoying this. I'm not trying to cut you off, Brad. I want to flag that. And the time has flown by.
Yeah. No,
right,
it's a lot of material. It's a lot of material to cover.
This one is a whale.
Yeah. Now I don't have a whole lot more biographical stuff. I mean, I could have went on forever, but Finnegan's Wake, he publishes it shortly. I mean, he doesn't live much longer after he publishes it. Publishes in 39, dies in 41. His health is a wreck in that intermediary period. His eyes are terrible. Like I said, gradually he's just being able to see less and less and less and less and less. And this is one of the things that's phenomenal to me about the density of reference in Finnegan's Wake is, how do you read the stuff you need to read to write that book if you literally can't see? Like, I almost don't understand the logistics of it in a way.
Yeah, I think about that a lot.
Right? But it's like, how do you? Yeah, and it's amazing. And he, for years, he had to read everything through a magnifying glass, and that was on a good day, So can you maybe one thing I feel like we didn't totally maybe talk about, is there a story to Finnegan's Wake, the novel itself? Like, if you could a person write a obviously highly abridged, but like a children's story version of the plot where like this happens, then this happens, then this happens? Or is that
sort of? And some summaries have been written, but the thing is, not everybody exactly agrees. About what happens, but we can broadly say that there are characters. And that it revolves, but the thing is, it's a dream. So characters are like changing and merging, but they seem to be formed out of a single family. And the father is known as HCE. The father and mother are known by these letter groupings. And so HCE stands for a whole bunch of names, and I'll read a few of them because it's pretty funny. The main one appears to be Humphrey Chimpden Earwicker, and is also known, you'll recall if you listen carefully to the intro there, we began at Howth Castle and environs, and that's HCE. So you'll start to see every time an HCE combo comes up, that's who you're dealing with. And just as an aside, the funny thing about like how crazy and abstract the opening page seems, we are at a specific place. Howth Castle is a real place in Ireland, and there's this little like peninsular area called Howth. And in fact, we end Ulysses sort of in Howth. We're in Molly's head. She's remembering when Bloom proposed to her, and they were on Howth Head, which is quite near Howth Castle. So we're in Howth Castle and environs, going past Even Adams, which is a church that's there. So we're in a specific place, and we're running so we have HCE, who is also Hod Cement and Edifices. Here Comes Everybody. That's probably the best because it, it explains, who he is. It's every man, all the Finnegans. Haveth Childers Everywhere, Hive Comb and Earwax. He Can Explain. And sometimes it shows up in reverse, as in Eagle Cock Hostel. And the mother is ALP, or Anna Livia Plurabelle. And among other things, Anna is the River Liffey, which runs through the city of Dublin and empties into Dublin Bay. Or she is the river, and HCE is the city Dublin itself. So there are these actual people, and then there are also these physical parts of the landscape, and there are these other abstract things. But as actual people, they are pub owners. HCE Earwicker is probably the main name that he's known by, and he is Earwicker is a real name. It's he's descended from. He's Norwegian, right? And this is another. So he's another outsider. So we have a Jewish hero of Ulysses, and we have a Norwegian hero of Finnegan's Wake, descended from Vikings. And there may be a pun on Vico here, but he's like an invader, right? An outsider,
right?
And so, anyways, they are pub owners, and their like non-dream names might be Porter. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay.
But they have two sons known as Shem and Sean, Shem the penman and Sean the post. And they are, so Shem is the archetype of the artist, and Sean is the archetype of the politician, I guess we could say. Shem is the writer, and then Sean is the one who sort of controls the means of disseminating the message, right? And so they're engaged in a constant kind of battle, which usually takes the form of just like interrogation and things like that. But it's kind of a rivalry that stands in for every kind of human competition and war. They're also James and his brother as well.
Right.
This is also a personal.
It's all brothers of all time, right?
Yeah. And so Shem is James Joyce, which he puns on his own name, calling himself Shame's voice in Finnegan's Wake. There's also a daughter named Issy, she's Isis, she is Azaelt, she's all these other things. So yeah, I don't want to go through there's a lot of different events and stuff, but I think you can kind of get the picture that there's kind of this one central mythical family and certain things that happen to them throughout.
I think by seeing them, how they're all multiple of these characters, I think that's where you can kind of start to understand what we're talking about in terms of trying to take the stream of consciousness into the dream, right? Mm-hmm. It's the metaphorical multivalency of everything and how he's compounding all of that.
May I say something? I'm on the Wikipedia, and of Finnegan's Wake, Joyce said, every syllable can be justified.
that doesn't surprise me. I had one thing I was going to read, which was, and I won't just because for time, but of all the various ways in which he had to he defended Finnegan's Wake, and that was one of them. Yeah, every syllable can be justified. He did carefully think about all of them. I think maybe we kind of draw down now just because we've kind of hit most of his life. I will say that he World War II eventually kind of came crashing down on their heads living in Paris, and he had to retreat to Zurich, where he lasted about a year in Zurich before being I think he had an ulcer that ruptured or something along those lines, and then he had a surgery, and then very, very rapidly after, he passed away and is buried in Zurich. Nora stayed in Zurich, and despite all of their fighting and their arguing, she had a number of very good things to say about him. It was very sweet. She said, it's very dull when James isn't around. He was always up to something, and clearly missed him. Though after he passed, she kind of started going back to church and returning to the church. One thing, I guess maybe we can kind of leave it on here. I've got a couple of sentences to read from the very end of Finnegan's Wake, and I want to remind where we started a little bit, where he meets Nora. James meets Nora near the River Liffey. He's a nobody. He thinks he's a genius, all of this. And he meets Nora and he says, "Is there one who understands?" Right? This is what he says in a very early letter to Nora. And I'm just going to read a couple sentences here until it starts to not make sense. This is in the last section of Finnegan's Wake. "I'd done me best when I was let, thinking always if I go, all goes, 100 cares, a tithe of trouble. And is there one who understands me? One in a thousand of years of the nights. All me life I have been lived among them, but now they are becoming loathed to me, and I am loathing their little warm tricks, and loathing their mean cozy turns, and all the greedy gushes out through their small souls, and all the lazy leaks down over their brash bodies. How small it's all. And me letting on to meself always, and jilting on all the time. I thought you were all glittering with the noblest of carriage. You're only a bumpkin. I thought you great in all things, and guilt and in glory. You're but a puny. Home. My people were not their sort out beyond there, so far as I can. For all the bold and bad and bleary they are blamed, the sea hags. No, nor for all our wild dances and all their wild din, I can see myself among them. Alanivia, Poltrabeld, how she was handsome, the wild Amazia, when she would seize me to her other breast, and what is the weird haughty Nelunia?" And then we can read just up to the last sentence because it sounds kind of dour, and then it gets kind of elevated. "Yes, carry me along, Taddy, like you done through the toy fair," which is a callback to something he did with Giorgio. "If I'd seen him bearing down on me now under white spread wings like he'd come from archangels, I'd die down over his feet, humbly dumbly, only to wash up. Yes, Tid, there's where, first, we pass through grash, be hushed the bush to, wish, a gull, gulls, far calls, coming far, end here, us then, fin again, take bus offly, memory, till thousands thee, lips, the key to, given, away alone, alas, the loved along the," and that's where it ends, as we said. So not that I'm expecting everybody to understand all of that necessarily, but that thing, one of the last things he wrote is there one who understands me? I think that's ultimately what Joyce was trying to do through all of this craziness and all of his genius. And we're still trying, I guess.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm inspired to pick up copies of Ulysses and of Finnegan's Wake. Brad, we have a link to a bookstore through the website, don't we?
We do, yeah. Bookshop.org. You can go through on the artofdarkpod.com and click on the bookstore link. We have an affiliate thing there. We get some sense if you buy a book.
Yeah. Well, and so to wind this down, how did he pass away? What finally took him?
Yeah, so it was I believe it was let's see. So it was a stomach issue. He'd been having pretty serious stomach ailments. So despite all of his eye stuff, he ultimately had to have a surgery. Oh, one thing worth noting, the last postcard he ever wrote was to his brother Stanislaw. And Stanislaw had been he had been, because of World War II. World War I, he'd spent in prison. World War II, he was a refugee from Trieste, and ended up in Florence. And James had sent him on a postcard a list of names of people who might be able to help him. That's the last thing he ever wrote. Actually, was a postcard of trying to help his brother, which is pretty cool. Yeah, it was I can't remember the name of it. It was a stomach thing, and they performed surgery. And he didn't last long after the surgery. Still fairly,
I understood.
Not the best. And
sure.
So he was on his way out, and in the Irish tradition, they buried him pretty quickly. So
is he buried in Dublin?
He's buried in Zurich.
Oh, he's buried in Zurich.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you ever go to Zurich, look for it. I think his gravestone is marked. And Nora is buried there as well, but she's not buried next to him. She's buried like 2 graves over. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, the Irish genes get around. I'm looking at a picture of him as a kid, and he looks like he could be like a distant relation of mine.
Right,
too strange.
Right.
And what a banger! So I'm gonna.
I hope so.
That was well over 3 hours. We're gonna do more, and we're gonna get into the dirty, filthy mind of James Joyce, in particular his letters to Nora, the thing that kept them together, presumably. But we do have a final Art of Darkness question. I want to thank you, Aldous, for coming on. That was really insightful. And I think we will have you on too, if you're game, for a part 2 with our friend Aaron Gwynn. Again, because Gwynn himself is a renowned novelist, a novelist of note, and he is throwing himself at us to do this episode to follow up. He really is. He's very excited. We love Aaron. Aaron's friend of the show.
Okay, great.
And again,
it's been my pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
I'm good. I'm glad.
Yeah, and I have one final Art of Darkness question, and I think we'll give it to you, Aldous. People can find you at Aldous Asterion on Twitter. We're going to continue on to the Patreon. Also, Forest of Symbols podcast. Very good, very interesting material there. If you liked what he had going on here, that's just a taste of what he does on that fine show. But Aldous, the question we ask at the end is, what would James Joyce be doing now if he was alive today? What do you think?
It's hard to believe that he wouldn't be online in some way. You mentioned that he did try to run a movie theater in Dublin, like the first one that was ever established there.
Yeah.
And he was interested in, even though he is a literary man, first and foremost, he was interested in like the new media that was coming up. Radio and TV does get referenced in Finnegan's Wake. So, I feel like he could have been a poster. He could have been a schizo poster. Right. I mean, really.
He would have been the greatest of them.
The ultimate schizo poster. Yeah. He'd have like 5 alts and they'd all be talking to one another. And you wouldn't quite know, is this one dude? What is this?
Right. Yeah, he'd be playing 5D chess for sure. Yeah.
Guys, this is tremendous. Let's do another 30 minutes on the After Dark. Brad, wonderful work with the research.
Thanks, thank you.
I really appreciate it. Stately, plump buck Brad Kelly. All right, guys. Later. Bye. Thanks, Aldous.